The automated confirmation chime of my secure banking application echoed in the hushed interior of my car. Transaction confirmed. $14 million vanished from our shared ledger in a fraction of a second, pulled from joint access and locked deep behind a biometric firewall that only my thumbprint could breach. I leaned back against the cool, stitched leather of the driver's seat and stared through the tinted glass. Out on the sprawling, manicured lawn of our Pennsylvania mainline estate, my husband Jonathan was hoisting our 1-year-old son Wyatt into the air for a hired photographer. Jonathan wore a crisp charcoal suit and a dazzling, practiced smile. He looked every bit the triumphant healthcare logistics titan he pretended to be for the magazines. He was laughing, posing for the cameras, playing the role of the perfect devoted father and husband. He had no idea his platinum credit cards were now nothing more than worthless pieces of plastic. He thought he had already won. He thought a recent boardroom maneuver had successfully stripped me of my founder shares, leaving me powerless and dependent on his public image. Just minutes ago, he had looked me dead in the eyes, adjusted the silver cufflinks I bought him for our anniversary, and delivered a cold ultimatum. He told me to accept his ongoing affair with my best friend, or he would initiate a divorce that would leave me penniless and invisible. He truly believed I would just lower my head, walk back out to the patio, and slice the birthday cake while he continued sleeping with the chief operating officer of the company I secretly built. He underestimated me. He forgot that the person who quietly writes the code always knows where the digital trapdoors are buried. He mistook my silence for weakness, assuming that because I preferred the shadows, I lacked the spine to survive the spotlight. My name is Sabrina Bradley, and I am 34 years old. If you are listening to this, tell me your age in the comments, and let me know if you have ever had to remind an arrogant partner exactly who holds the keys to the kingdom. Welcome to Emily Told Stories. Hit the like button and subscribe because you will want to hear every single detail of how a quiet wife dismantles a fabricated empire brick by brick. To understand how a decade-long relationship evaporates on a sunny autumn afternoon, you have to rewind exactly 30 minutes. The air carried the crisp scent of Appalachian pine mixed with hickory smoke from the caterers. I had spent months planning Wyatt's first birthday, transforming our backyard into a pristine celebration of our curated success. Dozens of executives, venture capitalists, and elite surgeons mingled under white canvas tents. The scene was a testament to our upward mobility. I was the biotech heiress who preferred writing predictive algorithms in the background. Jonathan was the charismatic frontman I had plucked from the gritty industrial sector of Philadelphia to serve as the public face of our firm. We were supposed to be the ultimate partnership. It was time for the cake cutting. I left the bright chatter of the patio and stepped into the cool, shadowed corridors of our stone manor. The house was a monument to colonial heritage, filled with rich mahogany and vintage tapestries. The ambient noise of the party faded as I approached his private, oak-paneled study. I noticed the heavy door resting slightly ajar. I pushed the brass handle inward. A colonial-era grandfather clock stood in the corner of the room. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of old-world stability. Right then, its rhythmic, mechanical ticking sounded like a countdown. Pressed against the edge of Jonathan's desk was Audrey, my closest confidant, the woman I had chosen as the chief operating officer of our firm. Her fingers were tangled in his dark hair, pulling him into a deep, desperate kiss. It was not a sudden, regrettable lapse in judgment. The embrace carried the fluid, unmistakable rhythm of a long-standing routine. The lingering scent of her signature jasmine perfume suddenly made perfect sense. It was the same fragrance I had noticed on Jonathan's collars after his supposed late-night board meetings. The heavy thud of my hand slipping off the brass doorknob broke them apart. Audrey stepped back, smoothing the wrinkles from her silk blouse. A faint flush crept up her neck, but her gaze held a sharp, defiant spark. She did not drop her eyes in shame. She looked at me like a rival who had just won a silent war. Jonathan did not flinch. He did not fall to his knees, nor did he scramble for excuses. He casually wiped a trace of lipstick from his jaw, walked toward me, and pushed the heavy oak door shut until the latch clicked into place, sealing us inside. "This is not a negotiation, Sabrina," he stated, his tone dripping with hollow corporate authority. He paced the length of the Persian rug, treating the betrayal as if it were a minor logistical hurdle. "The pressure I carry running this company is staggering. The market demands perfection. Audrey understands the weight of my position. She operates in my arena. You arrange centerpieces." He paused, checking his reflection in the glass of the antique display cabinet, before turning back to me. "I know you think your family wealth gives you leverage, but you have not been paying attention to the paperwork. Last quarter's executive restructure marginalized your founder shares. I control the voting blocks now. I hold the reins." He stepped into my personal space, leaning down just enough to make his height a weapon. "So here is your new reality. You are going to fix your posture, walk back out to that patio, and smile for the cameras. You will accept this arrangement. If you try to burn me, I will initiate a divorce that will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back. You are a ghost in this industry without my name." I studied the man standing before me. His ego had swelled so large it eclipsed his memory. He truly believed his own fabricated myth. He thought his charisma built the algorithms. He thought his boardroom speeches funded the offshore accounts. He mistook my quiet nature for submission, forgetting that the architect of a fortress always knows where the trapdoors are hidden. I looked at Audrey, who offered a tiny, triumphant smirk, then back at Jonathan. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or hurl a glass across the room. My heart rate barely elevated. I simply gave a slow, curt nod. Turning on my heel, I left the study without uttering a single word. The grandfather clock ticked steadily behind me, marking the final seconds of his fragile reign. I navigated the hallway, slipping past oblivious guests holding champagne flutes. A venture capitalist from New York stopped me to ask about the catering, and I offered a polite, seamless smile, telling him the chef would bring out the main course shortly. My voice did not tremble. Out on the terrace, Wyatt sat in his high chair, babbling happily at a floating silver balloon. I scooped my son into my arms. A fixed smear of blue icing coated his tiny fingers. He patted my shoulder, pressing the bright blue sugar deep into the fabric of my white designer blouse. I did not care about the stain. I held his warm, fragile weight against my chest, bypassing the valet and walking straight down the gravel path to where my SUV was parked near the iron gates. Which brought me to this exact moment. Sitting in the driver's seat, I placed my phone on the center console. The joint financial arteries were severed. Jonathan thought a standard boardroom maneuver could strip me of my empire. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between a figurehead and the creator. I shifted the car into drive, my tires crunching softly against the gravel. Let him enjoy the birthday cake. The real war had just begun. The automated confirmation chime of my secure banking application echoed in the hushed interior of my car. Transaction confirmed. $14 million vanished from our shared ledger in a fraction of a second, pulled from joint access and locked deep behind a biometric firewall that only my thumbprint could breach. I leaned back against the cool stitched leather of the driver's seat and stared through the tinted glass. Out on the sprawling, manicured lawn of our Pennsylvania mainline estate, my husband Jonathan was hoisting our 1-year-old son Wyatt into the air for a hired photographer. Jonathan wore a crisp charcoal suit and a dazzling practiced smile. He looked every bit the triumphant healthcare logistics titan he pretended to be for the magazines. He was laughing, posing for the cameras, playing the role of the perfect, devoted father and husband. He had no idea his platinum credit cards were now nothing more than worthless pieces of plastic. He thought he had already won. He thought a recent boardroom maneuver had successfully stripped me of my founder shares, leaving me powerless and dependent on his public image. Just minutes ago, he had looked me dead in the eyes, adjusted the silver cufflinks I bought him for our anniversary, and delivered a cold ultimatum. He told me to accept his ongoing affair with my best friend, or he would initiate a divorce that would leave me penniless and invisible. He truly believed I would just lower my head, walk back out to the patio, and slice the birthday cake, while he continued sleeping with the chief operating officer of the company I secretly built. He underestimated me. He forgot that the person who quietly writes the code always knows where the digital trapdoors are buried. He mistook my silence for weakness, assuming that because I preferred the shadows, I lacked the spine to survive the spotlight. My name is Sabrina Bradley, and I am 34 years old. If you are listening to this, tell me your age in the comments, and let me know if you have ever had to remind an arrogant partner exactly who holds the keys to the kingdom. Welcome to Emily Told Stories. Hit the like button and subscribe because you will want to hear every single detail of how a quiet wife dismantles a fabricated empire brick by brick. To understand how a decade-long relationship evaporates on a sunny autumn afternoon, you have to rewind exactly 30 minutes. The air carried the crisp scent of Appalachian pine mixed with hickory smoke from the caterers. I had spent months planning Wyatt's first birthday, transforming our backyard into a pristine celebration of our curated success. Dozens of executives, venture capitalists, and elite surgeons mingled under white canvas tents. The scene was a testament to our upward mobility. I was the biotech heiress who preferred writing predictive algorithms in the background. Jonathan was the charismatic frontman I had plucked from the gritty industrial sector of Philadelphia to serve as the public face of our firm. We were supposed to be the ultimate partnership. It was time for the cake cutting. I left the bright chatter of the patio and stepped into the cool, shadowed corridors of our stone manor. The house was a monument to colonial heritage, filled with rich mahogany and vintage tapestries. The ambient noise of the party faded as I approached his private, oak-paneled study. I noticed the heavy door resting slightly ajar. I pushed the brass handle inward. A colonial-era grandfather clock stood in the corner of the room. It was a family heirloom, a symbol of old-world stability. Right then, its rhythmic, mechanical ticking sounded like a countdown. Pressed against the edge of Jonathan's desk was Audrey, my closest confidant, the woman I had chosen as the chief operating officer of our firm. Her fingers were tangled in his dark hair, pulling him into a deep, desperate kiss. It was not a sudden, regrettable lapse in judgment. The embrace carried the fluid, unmistakable rhythm of a long-standing routine. The lingering scent of her signature jasmine perfume suddenly made perfect sense. It was the same fragrance I had noticed on Jonathan's collars after his supposed late-night board meetings. The heavy thud of my hand slipping off the brass doorknob broke them apart. Audrey stepped back, smoothing the wrinkles from her silk blouse. A faint flush crept up her neck, but her gaze held a sharp, defiant spark. She did not drop her eyes in shame. She looked at me like a rival who had just won a silent war. Jonathan did not flinch. He did not fall to his knees, nor did he scramble for excuses. He casually wiped a trace of lipstick from his jaw, walked toward me, and pushed the heavy oak door shut until the latch clicked into place, sealing us inside. "This is not a negotiation, Sabrina," he stated, his tone dripping with hollow corporate authority. He paced the length of the Persian rug, treating the betrayal as if it were a minor logistical hurdle. "The pressure I carry running this company is staggering. The market demands perfection. Audrey understands the weight of my position. She operates in my arena. You arrange centerpieces. He paused, checking his reflection in the glass of the antique display cabinet, before turning back to me. I know you think your family wealth gives you leverage, but you have not been paying attention to the paperwork. Last quarter's executive restructure marginalized your founder shares. I control the voting blocks now. I hold the reins. He stepped into my personal space, leaning down just enough to make his height a weapon. So here is your new reality. You are going to fix your posture, walk back out to that patio, and smile for the cameras. You will accept this arrangement. If you try to burn me, I will initiate a divorce that will leave you with nothing but the clothes on your back. You are a ghost in this industry without my name. I studied the man standing before me. His ego had swelled so large it eclipsed his memory. He truly believed his own fabricated myth. He thought his charisma built the algorithms. He thought his boardroom speeches funded the offshore accounts. He mistook my quiet nature for submission, forgetting that the architect of a fortress always knows where the trapdoors are hidden. I looked at Audrey, who offered a tiny triumphant smirk, then back at Jonathan. I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream or hurl a glass across the room. My heart rate barely elevated. I simply gave a slow, curt nod. Turning on my heel, I left the study, without uttering a single word. The grandfather clock ticked steadily behind me, marking the final seconds of his fragile reign. I navigated the hallway, slipping past oblivious guests holding champagne flutes. A venture capitalist from New York stopped me to ask about the catering, and I offered a polite, seamless smile, telling him the chef would bring out the main course shortly. My voice did not tremble. Out on the terrace, Wyatt sat in his high chair, babbling happily at a floating silver balloon. I scooped my son into my arms. A fixed smear of blue icing coated his tiny fingers. He patted my shoulder, pressing the bright blue sugar deep into the fabric of my white designer blouse. I did not care about the stain. I held his warm, fragile weight against my chest, bypassing the valet and walking straight down the gravel path to where my SUV was parked near the iron gates. Which brought me to this exact moment. Sitting in the driver's seat, I placed my phone on the center console. The joint financial arteries were severed. Jonathan thought a standard boardroom maneuver could strip me of my empire. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about the difference between a figurehead and the creator. I shifted the car into drive, my tires crunching softly against the gravel. Let him enjoy the birthday cake. The real war had just begun. The tires of my SUV gripped the winding asphalt as I left the main line behind, pointing the hood west toward the Appalachian foothills. The autumn air whipping past my window carried a sharp chill, stripping the turning leaves from the oak branches and scattering them across the road. Inside the cabin, the only sound was the steady breathing of Wyatt, asleep in his car seat, and the rhythmic thrum of the engine. I kept my gaze fixed on the highway, my hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel. My pulse had steadied. The initial shock of the oak-paneled study had already hardened into a cold, crystalline focus. Securing the personal joint accounts was merely the opening volley. Jonathan thought his recent executive reshuffle had neutralized my power. He failed to realize that when you build the underlying architecture of a multi-billion-dollar healthcare logistics firm, you do not hand over the master keys. I reached over to the encrypted tablet mounted on the center console. The screen cast a sterile blue glow across the dashboard. My fingers danced across the digital keyboard, navigating past the rudimentary firewalls Jonathan relied upon. I initiated the corporate capital extraction protocol. This was a failsafe I had coded into the firm's central framework 5 years ago, a silent mechanism designed to protect my private holding trust. Lines of data scrolled across the screen, verifying my biometric signature. I pressed my thumb against the sensor. The tablet vibrated once. A green confirmation bar filled the display. The controlling stakes, the preferred voting shares, and the bedrock capital of the entire logistics empire shifted seamlessly out of the active corporate pool. The assets vanished behind a digital fortress. Jonathan was officially presiding over an empty shell. He could keep his corner office and his tailored suits, but the oxygen feeding his operation now belonged entirely to me. Just as the extraction completed, a sharp, metallic ping echoed from the tablet speakers. I glanced at the screen. A banking alert flashed in bright yellow text. Transaction declined. Insufficient funds. A faint smile touched the corners of my mouth. I could picture the scene back at the estate perfectly. The party would be winding down. The elite catering company, the one that charged a premium for serving artisan appetizers on silver platters, would be presenting the final invoice. Jonathan would pull out his heavy platinum card, flashing that practiced, effortless charm, expecting the server to return with a polite thank you. Ping! A second alert flashed. He was trying a different card, perhaps the corporate expense account. Ping! A third alert. The digital starvation had begun. I imagined the color draining from Jonathan's face as the catering manager politely asked for an alternative form of payment. The venture capitalists and surgeons sipping champagne nearby would notice the delay. The whispers would start. Jonathan prided himself on projecting infinite wealth and seamless control. Right now, he was standing in the middle of a lavish party, unable to pay for the very cake his son was supposed to eat. He was experiencing the terror of a man stepping onto a staircase only to find the steps missing. My mind drifted from Jonathan to the woman standing beside him in that study. Audrey. The betrayal tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I had not just hired Audrey, I had resurrected her. My memory pulled me back to a rainy Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago. We were sitting in a cramped coffee shop in downtown Philadelphia. Audrey was shivering in a damp trench coat, hiding her face behind a cup of cheap tea. She was drowning in debt, fielding relentless calls from collection agencies, one step away from filing for personal bankruptcy. She had wept openly, mascara running down her cheeks, swearing her life was ruined. I did not offer empty sympathy. I pulled a checkbook from my purse, uncapped my pen, and wrote a check for $80,000. I slid it across the sticky table. I paid off every single cent she owed, handing her a clean slate. She had fallen into my arms, sobbing, promising she would spend the rest of her life repaying my kindness. I brought her into my company. I taught her the intricacies of healthcare logistics. I elevated her to Chief Operating Officer. I handed her a career, a reputation, and a fortune. And in return, she tangled her fingers in my husband's hair on my son's birthday. Another memory surfaced, sharp and sudden. A few months ago, Audrey and I were reviewing the quarterly projections in my living room. She had been uncharacteristically agitated, pacing the floor and complaining bitterly about Pennsylvania corporate tax laws. She had argued that our tax burden was stifling expansion, dropping pointed hints about the financial flexibility of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. At the time, I brushed it off as standard executive frustration. Now, examining the memory through the lens of their affair, the casual complaints transformed into a glaring red flag. She was not worried about the company tax burden. She was researching ways to move unmonitored capital out of the country. The pieces of the puzzle were locking together. This was not a crime of passion. It was a calculated heist. My phone resting in the cup holder suddenly lit up. The screen vibrated with a continuous, relentless buzz. I expected to see a barrage of angry text messages from Jonathan, demanding to know why his credit cards were frozen. Instead, the notifications were news alerts. My stomach tightened. I tapped the screen, opening a link sent by a trusted junior developer at the firm. The browser loaded a major Pennsylvania medical technology blog, a site read by every significant player in our industry. The headline spanned the top of the page in bold, aggressive lettering. Healthcare titan faces crisis as wife suffers severe postpartum breakdown at son birthday. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. I read the opening paragraphs. The article was a masterpiece of professional slander. It cited an anonymous senior executive source who painted a tragic, horrifying picture of my mental state. The narrative claimed I had been exhibiting erratic, dangerous behavior for months, culminating in a sudden, unhinged episode during Wyatt's party. The source alleged I had locked joint bank accounts in a fit of paranoid delusion, directly threatening the operational stability of the region's most vital medical supply chains. The piece framed Jonathan as the stoic, suffering visionary, doing everything in his power to protect his company and his child from a deranged spouse. Audrey. She was a public relations savant. She had bypassed the messy domestic fallout and gone straight for the jugular. She weaponized her media contacts to strike before I even reached the highway. This was her countermeasure. If I tried to expose the affair, they would point to this article and dismiss my claims as the paranoid ravings of a sick woman. They were building a legal and public foundation to strip away my credibility, my company, and ultimately, my son. I scrolled down to the comments section. The digital lynch mob was already forming. Industry insiders were debating whether the board of directors needed to step in immediately. Strangers were questioning my fitness as a mother. They were spinning a narrative where I was the villain, endangering the future of the innovative firm my own intellect had built. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. They were trying to publicly execute me using the very reputation I had financed. Jonathan and Audrey honestly believed they could control the narrative because they held the microphones. They thought I would crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and retreat into hiding. I locked the phone screen and tossed the device onto the passenger seat. The anger that had been simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, lethal resolve. Victimhood required an audience, and I had no intention of playing the tragic housewife. I was busy preparing an autopsy for their careers. The GPS guided me off the main highway, directing the SUV onto a secluded private road winding deep into the forested hills. The towering pines cast long, dark shadows over the asphalt. I was nearing the fortified estate of my brother Nathan. I needed a war room, and Nathan possessed the most ruthless legal mind in Philadelphia. The PR strike proved Jonathan and Audrey were playing for keeps. They had fired the first shot in the public square, but they were oblivious to the arsenal I was bringing to the battlefield. I pressed the accelerator, the engine surging as the heavy iron gates of Nathan's property came into view through the gathering twilight. The heavy tires of my vehicle chewed the gravel as I merged onto the winding two-lane highway, cutting deep into the Appalachian foothills. The autumn wind battered the windshield, stripping dying leaves from the oak branches and scattering them across the dark asphalt. Inside the cabin, a sterile silence reigned, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of my son, secured in his car seat in the back. I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, my hands resting lightly on the leather steering wheel. My pulse had steadied. The initial shock of discovering my husband in his oak-paneled study had already hardened into a cold, crystalline focus. The encrypted tablet mounted on my dashboard emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. A notification materialized against the dark screen. Transaction declined. Vendor Elite Mainline Catering. Amount, $22,500. A faint smile touched the corners of my mouth. I envisioned Jonathan standing on the flagstone patio, beneath the sprawling white canvas tents, flashing his expensive veneers at the lead event coordinator. He would casually slide his heavy metal card into the reader, expecting the machine to swiftly approve the exorbitant fee for the artisan sliders, the imported truffle oil hors d'oeuvres, and the vintage champagne flowing freely among our guests. Instead, he would encounter a glaring red error code. He prided himself on projecting infinite wealth and seamless control, Right now, he was standing in the middle of a lavish gathering, unable to pay for the very celebration he was using to court new investors. Another chime pierced the quiet cabin. Transaction declined. Vendor Prestige Valet Services. Amount $4,000. Jonathan was scrambling now. He was likely patting the pockets of his charcoal suit, offering charming excuses about a banking glitch, pulling out a secondary corporate card to save face in front of the venture capitalists and surgeons milling around our yard. He did not realize the corporate cards were tied to the master ledger. I tapped the biometric scanner on the tablet frame. My fingerprint authorized the final phase of my digital firewall. Years ago, long before Jonathan ever graced the cover of a regional business magazine or delivered a keynote address, I sat in a dimly lit server room in a cramped apartment. I spent thousands of hours writing the complex predictive algorithms that form the unshakable foundation of our healthcare logistics empire. I understood the architecture of the system because I laid every single digital brick. I coded a failsafe, a silent emergency extraction protocol buried deep within the network layers, designed specifically to bypass executive overrides. With a single swipe across the glass, I severed the active capital from the public accounts. I watched the progress bar turn green as the preferred voting shares shifted seamlessly into my private, impenetrable holding trust. Jonathan was now presiding over a hollow shell. He could keep his corner office and his tailored suits, but the oxygen feeding his operation belonged entirely to me. The digital starvation of my husband felt satisfying, but the thought of Audrey festered in my mind like a slow-acting poison. The betrayal was not a spontaneous mistake, it was a calculated heist executed by a woman I had resurrected from financial ruin. My mind drifted back 4 years to a freezing Tuesday in November. I was sitting in a cramped, noisy cafe in downtown Philadelphia. Audrey sat across from me, shivering in a damp trench coat. She was drowning in medical debt and aggressive collection calls, weeping into a cup of cheap green tea. She swore her life was over. I did not offer empty platitudes. I opened my purse, uncapped my pen, and wrote a cashier check for $80,000. I pushed the crisp paper across the sticky table, wiping away her debts in a single stroke. She grasped my hands, crying tears of profound gratitude, vowing eternal loyalty. I handed her a career. I mentored her, eventually elevating her to Chief Operating Officer. And how did she repay me? By cornering my husband in his study. The clues had been hiding in plain sight. Just 3 months prior, we were sitting in my living room reviewing quarterly projections. Audrey paced the hardwood floor, nursing a glass of red wine. She complained bitterly about Pennsylvania corporate tax structures. She argued the state regulations were strangling our profit margins, subtly praising the financial flexibility of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. At the time, I assumed she was just venting executive frustration. Now, gripping the steering wheel, the reality hit me. She was not worried about our logistics firm. She was testing the waters. She was researching ways to move unmonitored capital out of the country. My phone, resting in the center console cup holder, suddenly erupted. It was not the predictable barrage of angry messages from Jonathan, demanding answers about his frozen credit cards. It was a rapid-fire sequence of news alerts. I asked the vehicle voice command system to read the notifications. The robotic voice filled the cabin, reciting the headline from the most prominent medical technology publication in the state. Healthcare titan faces operational crisis as wife suffers severe postpartum breakdown. My foot eased off the accelerator. I guided the vehicle onto the narrow shoulder of the highway, shifting into park. I picked up the phone and read the article myself. It was a masterpiece of malicious public relations. The piece cited an anonymous senior executive source, Audrey. She had bypassed the messy domestic fallout and gone straight for the jugular, weaponizing her deep media connections. The article painted a tragic, horrifying picture of my mental state. It claimed I had been exhibiting erratic, dangerous behavior for months, culminating in a sudden, unhinged episode during my son's first birthday party. The source alleged I had locked joint bank accounts in a fit of paranoid delusion, directly threatening the operational stability of the region's most vital medical supply chains. The narrative framed Jonathan as the stoic, suffering visionary, doing everything in his power to protect his company and his child from a deranged spouse. I scrolled down to the comments section beneath the article. The digital mob was already forming with terrifying speed. I recognized the screen names of industry insiders and rival executives debating whether our board of directors needed to step in and forcefully remove me. Strangers were casually questioning my fitness as a mother, suggesting Child Protective Services should be involved for Wyatt's safety. They were spinning a toxic, fabricated narrative where I was the unstable villain, actively endangering the future of the innovative firm my own intellect had birthed. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was breathtaking. They were trying to publicly execute me using the very reputation I had financed. Jonathan and Audrey honestly believed they could control the narrative because they held the microphones. They thought I would crumble under the weight of public scrutiny, assuming a quiet coder would retreat into hiding when thrust into the harsh glare of a media scandal. They were building a legal and public foundation to strip away my credibility, my company, and ultimately, my son. I locked the phone screen and tossed the device onto the passenger seat. The anger simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, lethal resolve. Victimhood required an audience, and I had no intention of playing the tragic housewife. I shifted the car back into drive, my tires kicking up dirt as I pulled onto the highway. The navigation system indicated I was only 10 minutes away from my brother-fortified estate. The public relations strike proved Jonathan and Audrey were playing for keeps. They fired the first shot in the public square, oblivious to the arsenal I was bringing to the battlefield. I pressed the accelerator, the engine surging as the heavy iron gates of Nathan property came into view through the gathering twilight. The imposing wrought iron gates of my brother property loomed out of the dark Appalachian landscape like the entrance to an impenetrable fortress. High-definition night vision security cameras tracked the movement of my vehicle as the heavy metal barriers parted with a smooth, mechanical hum. I guided the SUV up the winding cobblestone driveway, the tires crunching loudly against the pristine stones in the crisp Pennsylvania night air. The dense forest surrounding the property created a natural soundproof barrier, isolating the estate from the rest of the world. Nathan stood on the sprawling front porch, waiting for my arrival. He wore a crisp navy suit, looking every bit the fierce, cutthroat Philadelphia corporate attorney he was widely known to be. He did not offer a warm, comforting embrace when I stepped out of the driver's seat, holding my sleeping son. Nathan operated strictly on logic, strategy, and calculated execution. He understood that tears were useless in a crisis. He simply gave a sharp nod and reached out to take the heavy diaper bag from my shoulder and ushered us swiftly inside the cold stone manor. We bypassed the formal living spaces, adorned with expensive art, and headed straight for his private subterranean study. It was a room designed specifically for dismantling rival corporate empires. I laid Wyatt down gently in a portable crib we set up in the quiet corner of an adjacent guest suite, ensuring he was safe, comfortable, and entirely oblivious to the incoming storm that was about to upend his life. When I returned to the study, Nathan was already pouring a steaming cup of black coffee from a sleek stainless steel thermal carafe. He slid the heavy ceramic mug across the polished mahogany table toward me. The bitter dark liquid radiated a deep, comforting heat against my cold palms. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the strong caffeine sharpen my senses for the battle ahead. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Nathan did not waste valuable time asking how I felt about my marriage collapsing into ashes. He treated the situation with the precise, clinical detachment of a hostile takeover. He pressed a button on his desk console, bringing a broad, wall-mounted monitor to life. The screen displayed highly confidential internal corporate emails intercepted directly from our healthcare logistics firm. "Your husband is moving significantly faster than we anticipated," Nathan stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded attention. He tapped a silver laser pointer against the glowing screen, highlighting a specific chain of urgent messages. "He is utilizing that defamatory public relations article Audrey published as a foundational block for a swift legal coup." My eyes scanned the intercepted communications, absorbing the brutal reality of their scheme. The words on the screen detailed an emergency board of directors meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jonathan had drafted a formal petition to invoke a highly obscure medical incapacitation clause buried deep within the original company bylaws. Because the false public narrative now painted me as a severe danger to the operational stability of the firm due to fabricated postpartum delusions, Jonathan argued that my preferred voting rights needed to be suspended indefinitely. It was a terrifyingly brilliant maneuver. He was weaponizing my recent pregnancy, exploiting societal biases, and leveraging Audrey lies to legally steal my assets right out from under me. If the terrified board voted in his favor to save the company stock price, I would lose the firm, my financial leverage, and quite possibly face a brutal family court battle for primary custody of my son. A lesser woman might have panicked under the crushing weight of that revelation. I simply set my coffee mug down on a leather coaster and reached into my structured tote bag. I pulled out a heavy military-grade laptop, a specialized device stripped of all standard commercial tracking software, and wrapped in a durable brushed aluminum casing. The sterile blue glow of the screen illuminated my face as I booted the encrypted operating system. "You assume I am just now building a defense strategy?" I told my brother, my fingers flying across the complex keyboard layout. "You forget that I analyze predictive patterns and build unshakable algorithms for a living. I did not need to catch my husband kissing my chief operating officer in his study to know a profound betrayal was brewing in the background." Nathan crossed his arms over his broad chest, his sharp eyes narrowing with genuine curiosity as he watched me work. I bypassed multiple security gateways and pulled up a hidden partitioned folder on the hard drive. 8 months ago, I noticed microscopic fractional discrepancies in Jonathan travel expense reports. I explained, keeping my tone perfectly level and devoid of emotion. They were tiny irregularities, the kind a standard corporate accountant would easily dismiss as insignificant rounding errors or administrative mistakes. But I wrote the foundational financial algorithms for our entire firm. I saw the invisible leaks. I spent weeks tracing those missing funds through a complex labyrinth of dummy corporations, eventually following the digital trail straight into undisclosed offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. Nathan let out a low, impressed whistle, his brilliant legal mind instantly recognizing the staggering magnitude of the crime. Jonathan was dodging federal taxes and siphoning corporate capital on an immense scale. I looked up from the sterile glow of the monitor, meeting my brother's fierce, calculating gaze. I did not confront him about the missing money, I continued. I did not file for divorce in a standard civil court, where his high-priced lawyers could drag the proceedings out for a decade, draining my resources and energy. Instead, I compiled a flawless, comprehensive dossier detailing every single illegal wire transfer, every forged digital signature, and every hidden offshore asset. I submitted a formal, heavily documented whistleblower report directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. They have been quietly building an airtight federal indictment for the past 8 months. I have just been waiting for Jonathan to make one final fatal mistake to hand them the last piece of undeniable concrete evidence. The federal raid is already primed and waiting in the shadows. We just have to strike the match to light the fuse. My brother smiled a chilling, predatory expression that promised profound ruin for his soon-to-be former brother-in-law. The pathetic corporate coup Jonathan was planning meant nothing if he was wearing federal handcuffs before the market opened. I reached for my smartphone, resting on the mahogany table, intending to check the live security feeds from our mainline estate. As I unlocked the screen, my thumb hovered over a seemingly innocuous application icon shaped like a silver shield. 3 years ago, Jonathan had insisted on installing a premium family safety tracking application on my personal device. He had spun a charming, protective narrative, claiming he desperately needed to know I was safe when driving alone at night or attending late meetings. In reality, it was a toxic digital tether, a specialized tool for a controlling narcissist to monitor my every move and ensure I never stepped out of line. He thought he was keeping a tight leash on a naive, compliant wife. He failed to realize that the application utilized two-way location sharing protocols. I never removed the software. I kept it running silently in the background, a digital Trojan horse sitting right in his tailored suit pocket. With a few quick, sophisticated modifications to the source code, I could pinpoint his exact geographic coordinates down to the specific square meter. I tapped the shield icon, activating the reverse tracking protocol. A detailed digital map materialized on the high-resolution screen, a pulsing blue dot indicating his real-time location. The dot was not stationary at our estate. It was moving rapidly down the digital highway, heading directly toward the dense Appalachian foothills. He was utilizing the very same application to track my vehicle. He was coming here, right to the fortress. Before I could even verbalize the urgent warning to Nathan, the heavy silence of the subterranean study was shattered. The perimeter security alarm blared a sharp, piercing klaxon that echoed fiercely off the stone walls. The intercom unit on Nathan's broad desk buzzed with frantic energy. The exterior high-definition camera feeds flickered onto the main wall monitor, replacing the intercepted corporate emails. Jonathan had arrived at the towering iron gates of the property, and he did not come alone to negotiate a peaceful surrender. He had brought an entire hostile mob to my doorstep, ready to execute his final, desperate threat under the cover of night. The harsh glare of the security monitors painted Nathan's subterranean study in a sickly pale hue. We stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the chaotic scene unfolding at the edge of his property. Thick autumn fog rolled off the Appalachian foothills, but the dense mist was repeatedly pierced by the frantic strobing of red and blue police lights. Several local cruisers had parked haphazardly across the entrance, blocking the winding rural road. Parked right behind them were two large broadcast vans with towering antennas and blinding white halogen lamps. My husband had not come to have a rational discussion about our crumbling marriage. He had orchestrated a theatrical siege. Jonathan stood front and center, gripping the thick wrought iron bars of the main gate. He was putting on the performance of his life, his face twisted into a mask of desperate paternal agony. Flanking him was his mother, Patricia. She was wrapped in a tailored cashmere coat, clutching her trademark pearl necklace, looking every bit the distressed matriarch of elite Pennsylvania society. She had spent decades cultivating a pristine reputation at country club luncheons and high society charity galas, ensuring everyone viewed her family as royalty. Right beside them stood a stern woman, wearing a state-issued lanyard, an agent from Child Protective Services. Jonathan was playing his hand, attempting to legitimize the defamatory article Audrey had published just hours prior. He wanted the world to see me dragged out of the house in handcuffs, cementing the narrative of my supposed insanity. Nathan reached for the intercom button to order private security to disperse the crowd, but I placed my hand over his wrist. Hiding behind stone walls would only feed their fabricated story. A woman suffering a severe mental break cowers in the dark. A mother who owns her truth walks directly into the light. I turned away from the monitors and walked upstairs to the guest suite where Wyatt was sleeping soundly. From my travel bag, I retrieved a thick, pristine leather binder. I had spent the last 2 years maintaining meticulous records of my son's life, a habit born from my background in data architecture. I carried the binder downstairs, meeting Nathan in the grand foyer. He did not question my decision. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, grabbed a sleek portable high-definition deposition camera from his briefcase, and opened the heavy front doors. The biting night wind whipped at my coat as we marched down the long cobblestone driveway. The crunch of our footsteps was soon drowned out by the escalating clamor at the gate. Reporters shouted overlapping questions through the iron bars, demanding a statement regarding the mental health allegations. Camera shutters clicked in a relentless frenzy. I did not rush. I maintained a measured, deliberate pace. As we reached the imposing gate, Nathan set his specialized camera onto the flat stone pillar, tapping a button on the side. A distinct, glowing red recording light blinked to life, capturing the entire confrontation in undeniable clarity. The Child Protective Services agent stepped forward, holding a clipboard like a shield. She introduced herself with a harsh, clinical tone, stating she was responding to an emergency anonymous tip. The caller claimed I was undergoing a dangerous psychological crisis and holding an infant in a hazardous environment. Jonathan leaned his forehead against the cold iron, adopting a trembling voice. "Please, Sabrina," he pleaded for the benefit of the news microphones. "Just hand him over. Get the medical help you need. I will handle the company. Just let our boy be safe." I ignored his pathetic acting. I looked directly into the eyes of the state agent. My posture remained rigid, my breathing calm and even. I did not raise my voice over the clamoring press. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority that forced the journalists to stop shouting just to hear me. I slid the leather binder through a narrow gap in the wrought iron bars. I advised the agent to review the contents before participating in a retaliatory stunt orchestrated by a man whose credit cards had just been universally declined. The agent opened the binder hesitantly. The blinding white lights of the news vans illuminated the pages. Inside, she found a flawless, comprehensive medical history. There were detailed dietary logs, up-to-date vaccination records, and a pediatric file signed directly by the head of neonatal care at Stanford University. Behind those documents were notarized character statements from prominent philanthropic leaders and board directors across Pennsylvania, attesting to my unwavering stability and dedication as a mother. The stern expression on the agent's face dissolved into profound professional embarrassment. She flipped through the pristine pages, realizing instantly that she had been weaponized by a vindictive spouse. She closed the binder, handing it back through the bars with a quiet apology, stating she would officially note the malicious nature of the tip in the state registry. Patricia could not handle the sudden shift in momentum. She watched the state agent back down, her entire plan unraveling before the flashing cameras. Desperation makes arrogant people remarkably sloppy. She lunged forward, pressing her face near the iron bars, her manicured finger pointing directly at my chest. "You are a cold, calculated iceberg!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with unchecked hysteria. "You drove him to it. If you had just paid attention to him instead of your computers, he would not have needed to find comfort elsewhere." The reporters leaned in closer, thrusting their microphones toward the frantic woman in cashmere. I remained perfectly still, letting the silence draw her deeper into the trap. "He deserves a woman who actually supports his vision," Patricia shrieked, entirely losing her grip on reality. "I knew Audrey was better for him the moment they started seeing each other. I hosted them at my own estate every weekend you were busy locked in your office. I kept him stress-free. I protected my son from your neglect." A deafening hush fell over the gathered media. The only sound was the cold wind howling through the trees and the rhythmic blinking of the glowing red recording light on Nathan's stone pillar. Patricia's chest heaved as she caught her breath, but the triumphant glare in her eyes quickly faded as she registered the profound silence. She slowly turned her head, looking at the cluster of journalists staring back at her with wide, hungry eyes. She looked at the high-definition deposition camera, recording her every word. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. In her frantic attempt to defend her son, She had just confessed on a live broadcast and a legal recording device to actively facilitating and hiding a deceitful affair. The elite country club reputation she prized above all else was instantly incinerated. She would be a social pariah by sunrise. Jonathan realized his mother had just destroyed whatever fragile public sympathy they possessed. The weeping father facade vanished, replaced by the genuine, terrifying rage of a cornered narcissist. He kicked the base of the iron gate, glaring at Nathan. "Open this gate right now!" Jonathan demanded, dropping the theatrical sorrow. "I need access to my personal assets. I need to return to my home on the main line and retrieve my property. You cannot keep me locked out of my own life." Nathan stepped forward, a lethal predator in a tailored suit. He did not shout. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. He slid it through the gap in the bars right into Jonathan's chest. Jonathan snatched the envelope, ripping it open with frantic, jerky movements. His eyes scanned the crisp legal document inside. "That is a formal 24-hour eviction notice," Nathan stated, his voice carrying clearly over the rustling wind. "You seem to have forgotten the structural details of your own lavish lifestyle. The mainline estate is not marital property. It is owned entirely by Sabrina's private real estate trust. Your name is nowhere on the deed. You are legally classified as a tenant, and you just fundamentally violated the strict morality clause buried in your lease agreement. Private security will arrive tomorrow at noon to physically remove your belongings from the premises." Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her knees literally buckling beneath her cashmere coat. She grasped the iron bars to keep from collapsing onto the asphalt. Her golden child, the man she had just ruined her own life to defend, was going to be homeless by tomorrow afternoon. I watched Jonathan, expecting the crushing reality of losing his status symbol mansion to finally break his spirit. I expected the panic to set in. Instead, his breathing slowed. He lowered the eviction notice, and a dark, chilling smirk crept across his face. He folded the document and casually tossed it onto the wet pavement at his feet. "Keep the empty house, Sabrina," he sneered, his voice dripping with venomous confidence. "You think playing real estate games will save your empire? While you were busy packing your bags and running to your brother, Audrey and I were busy restructuring the future." He took a step back from the gate, adjusting his ruined suit jacket. "We transferred the core logistical patents this evening," he revealed, a twisted sense of victory lighting up his eyes. "Every single piece of proprietary technology that makes the firm valuable was migrated to a newly formed shell corporation. I do not care about the house or the joint accounts. I just stripped the company bare. You are holding the keys to a dead machine." He turned around, grabbing his mother by the arm and dragging her toward their waiting vehicle, leaving the frantic news crews shouting questions at his back. I watched his taillights disappear into the fog. My pulse, which had remained so steady during the confrontation, began to thrum with a new, dangerous rhythm. Jonathan thought he had executed a masterstroke of corporate theft. He thought he had outsmarted the architect. I turned to Nathan, the cold night air biting at my cheeks. We needed to get back to the subterranean study immediately. I needed to tear open the digital veins of his new shell company and see exactly what he thought he had stolen, because a thief always leaves a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to their own demise. The cold night air still clung to my wool coat as Nathan and I descended the staircase back into the subterranean study. The heavy reinforced doors sealed shut behind us, cutting off the ambient noise of the wind and isolating us in sterile silence. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the iron gates still hummed in my veins, but I forced my breathing to slow. Panic is a useless emotion when you are hunting. Jonathan had stood on the wet asphalt and boasted about migrating our core logistical patents to a newly formed shell corporation. He believed he had delivered a fatal strike, stripping the empire bare and leaving me holding an empty husk. He was a salesman, blinded by his own hubris. He failed to comprehend that a thief who steals a digital vault still leaves footprints in the snow. I walked straight to the mahogany desk and opened the heavy military-grade laptop. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the dark wood. I settled into the leather chair, letting my fingers rest on the keys. 5 years ago, when our healthcare firm was nothing more than a chaotic startup operating out of a cramped industrial loft in Philadelphia, Jonathan was busy attending networking dinners. He spent his evenings shaking hands with regional hospital directors, desperate to look like an established mogul. While he was playing dress-up in cheap suits, I was sitting alone under flickering fluorescent lights, writing the foundational predictive algorithms that would eventually revolutionize medical supply chains. Because I knew the system on a molecular level, I wove a ghost protocol deep into the core architecture. It was a hidden backdoor, a silent, invisible tether that bypassed all front-facing administrative locks. I never told my husband it existed. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I bypassed the standard commercial firewalls Jonathan had recently installed. He had spent a fortune on cybersecurity software, dressing the network in impressive corporate buzzwords. But a lock only works if the person who built the house does not hold a master key. I typed a specific sequence of commands invoking the ghost protocol. The graphical user interface dissolved. The screen went pitch black, followed immediately by lines of cascading green code raining down the monitor. The raw, unfiltered data of our entire enterprise was now laid bare before me. I targeted the intellectual property transfer logs from the past 6 hours. Jonathan had indeed initiated a massive data migration, sweeping the proprietary algorithms out of our primary servers. I isolated the destination routing numbers and pulled the registration records for the receiving entity. The shell corporation was named Apex Solutions, registered under a remote address in Delaware. The managing director listed on the incorporation documents was Audrey. I dug deeper, analyzing the financial anatomy of Apex Solutions. My eyes scanned the scrolling green text, and a chilling realization washed over me. This shell company was not just a dormant vault designed to hold stolen patents. It was a pulsing, active artery connected directly to our central corporate accounts. For the past 4 months, staggering sums of capital had been systematically siphoned out of our primary research and development fund and funneled straight into Audrey offshore holding accounts. They were bleeding the company dry from the inside out. But as I continued dissecting the encrypted outgoing mail servers connected to the shell entity, the narrative of their pristine romance began to fracture. Audrey was highly competent. I had trained her myself. She learned just enough about network routing to be incredibly dangerous. I decrypted a hidden folder containing her private external communications. She had been exchanging covert encrypted emails with a rival biotech conglomerate based in Boston. I read the messages, the cold glow of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The betrayal deepened into something far more sinister than a simple office affair. Audrey was secretly negotiating the outright sale of the stolen algorithms to this competitor. The proposed payout was astronomical enough to fund a luxurious anonymous life anywhere in the world. Yet the structure of the pending transaction revealed a breathtaking double cross. Audrey mandated that the Boston firm route the purchase funds solely into her personal decentralized accounts. She was not planning to share the spoils with Jonathan. She was engineering a flawless paper trail designed to make him look like the sole architect of the corporate theft. She planned to finalize the sale, liquidate the assets, and vanish into the wind, leaving my husband holding the bag when the federal investigators inevitably arrived. She was setting him up to take the fall for the entire heist. He threw away his marriage for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient, disposable scapegoat. Her framing plan was meticulous. It would have worked perfectly, shielding her from federal scrutiny, while ensuring Jonathan faced decades in a penitentiary. But Audrey failed to account for one crucial variable. Jonathan possessed an ego that demanded constant feeding. I traced a recent outgoing wire transfer originating from the shell company primary ledger. The transaction occurred just 2 days ago. It was a payment for $2 million. I pulled up the corresponding digital receipt. It was a closing down payment for a luxury high-rise penthouse overlooking the Schuylkill River, complete with panoramic views of the Philadelphia skyline. Jonathan could not resist buying a shiny new trophy to celebrate his impending victory. I scrutinized the digital signature attached to the property transfer authorization. When finalizing the real estate purchase, the buyer is required to verify their identity through an electronic portal. Audrey had warned him to use the encrypted proxy servers for all transactions. But Jonathan, likely sitting in a coffee shop or lounging in his office, chose convenience over caution. He logged into the secret shell account using an unsecured network. The digital receipt carried a unique forensic fingerprint, an IP address. I ran a reverse trace on the numeric string. The terminal window flickered as the system queried regional cellular towers. The geolocation coordinates resolved, pinging directly back to the specific smartphone currently resting in Jonathan Taylor's pocket. By using his personal traceable device to buy that penthouse, he permanently and undeniably linked himself to the stolen research funds. His arrogance had just ruined Audrey's pristine getaway plan. He dragged himself right into the center of the federal wire fraud conspiracy, leaving a glowing digital beacon pointing straight at his own chest. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the profound irony settle over me. They thought they were a team of brilliant masterminds executing a flawless corporate assassination. In reality, they were two greedy amateurs tripping over their own unchecked ambition, tearing each other apart before the ink on their fake contracts could even dry. I tapped the print command on my keyboard. The high-speed laser printer resting on the corner of Nathan's mahogany desk whirred to life. It began spitting out page after page of irrefutable evidence. I printed the financial ledgers exposing the embezzled research funds. I printed the IP trace, proving Jonathan authorized the penthouse purchase with stolen money. And I printed the decrypted emails detailing Audrey's calculated plot to sell the patents and frame her lover. Nathan walked over, picking up the stack of warm paper. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the documents with the practiced speed of a veteran litigator. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He looked at me, tapping the thick stack of evidence against the edge of the desk. "We have the bullets," he stated, his voice ringing with quiet, lethal confidence. "We have enough paper here to send them both to a federal holding cell before lunchtime." I reached out and took the documents from his hands, sliding them carefully into a sleek black leather folder. We had the ammunition, but the timing of the execution required precision. Jonathan was not waiting for the dust to settle. He had already scheduled an emergency board of directors meeting for sunrise. He intended to walk into that soundproof room, present his forged psychiatric evaluations, and convince the terrified executives to strip my voting rights indefinitely. He planned to legally steal the firm before the news of his embezzlement could ever reach the surface. I closed the laptop and tucked it under my arm. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, signaling the arrival of the early morning hours. The sun would be rising over the Philadelphia skyline soon, illuminating the glass towers of the financial district. Jonathan thought he had successfully backed a quiet, naive housewife into a corner. He was about to learn what happens when you lock a predator in a boardroom. The early morning sun broke over the Philadelphia skyline, casting long golden reflections across the glass and steel exterior of our corporate headquarters. The towering monolith stood as a physical manifestation of the empire I had engineered from a cramped apartment years ago. I stepped through the revolving doors, my tailored wool trench coat sweeping past the polished marble columns. The sharp, rhythmic click of my stilettos echoed through the cavernous atrium, a steady drumbeat signaling an approaching storm. Nathan walked one pace behind my right shoulder, carrying the sleek black leather folder containing the forensic financial autopsy. His posture radiated the undeniable gravity of a veteran corporate litigator walking into a courtroom he already owned. The security details stationed at the front desk immediately stood up, their hands hovering nervously over their radios. For years, these guards only saw me as the quiet, unassuming wife who occasionally dropped off forgotten briefcases or attended holiday parties in modest dresses. They had likely received strict orders to bar my entry following the defamatory news article published at dawn. A burly supervisor stepped into our path, holding up a hesitant hand to halt our progress. Nathan did not break his stride. He did not shout or issue boisterous threats. He simply fixed the supervisor with a cold, unyielding glare, slipping a Platinum Bar Association credential from his breast pocket. He stated in a low, steady rumble that interfering with a majority shareholder access to a scheduled governance meeting would result in an immediate crippling civil lawsuit. The supervisor swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Nathan's fierce expression and my icy calm demeanor. The guard lowered his hand, stepping aside without uttering a single word of protest. We bypassed the standard security checkpoints and strode directly into the executive elevator bank. I swiped a Legacy Master keycard I had quietly coded for myself on the day we acquired the building. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing us in a pressurized cabin as we ascended to the top floor. When the polished steel doors parted, we stepped out onto the executive tier. The plush carpets absorbed our footsteps as we approached the central boardroom. The space was encased in thick, soundproof glass, offering panoramic views of the Schuylkill River, winding through the city below. Through the transparent walls, I could see the emergency assembly was already underway. Sitting at the head of the sprawling obsidian conference table was Jonathan. He wore a pristine navy suit, looking impeccably groomed and entirely unbothered by the fact that he was actively attempting to steal my life work. Seated just to his right, leaning in with an expression of demure, manufactured concern, was Audrey. She had traded her usual vibrant silk blouses for a conservative, muted dress, playing the role of the loyal, steadfast executive supporting a grieving leader. 6 board members occupied the remaining high-backed leather chairs. These were old guard venture capitalists, men who prioritized stock valuations and public optics far above ethical loyalty. They looked exhausted, their expensive ties loosened, clutching ceramic coffee mugs as they stared anxiously at the thick manila folders resting before them. I pushed the heavy glass door open. It swung inward silently, but the sudden shift in air pressure caused every head in the room to turn simultaneously. The low hum of Jonathan speaking came to an abrupt halt. The color drained from Audrey's cheeks, her manicured fingers tightening around an expensive fountain pen. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging panicked glances. They had just spent their morning reading horrific, fabricated headlines about my mental stability, and now the supposed villain was standing right inside their sanctuary. Jonathan recovered his composure with chilling speed. He stood up slowly, letting a heavy, theatrical sigh escape his lips. He looked at the gathered directors, adopting a tone of deep, reluctant sorrow, twisting my sudden arrival to fit his false narrative perfectly. Gentleman Jonathan began, his voice thick with fake emotion, gesturing toward me with an open palm. This is exactly the erratic, unpredictable behavior I was just describing. I implored her to stay home and rest to seek the medical intervention she so clearly requires. Instead, she forces her way into a secure facility, proving she has entirely lost her grip on reality. He leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the dark obsidian table, commanding the attention of the frightened investors. "Please review the documents I just distributed," he instructed gently. I did not need to open the folders to know what poison they contained. From where I stood near the entrance, I could clearly see the top page resting in front of the board chairman. It was a formal psychiatric evaluation, printed on crisp medical letterhead. At the bottom of the page sat a sloppy cursive signature belonging to a concierge physician Jonathan had undoubtedly paid off. The fabricated report utilized alarming clinical jargon to detail a fictitious diagnosis of severe postpartum psychosis. It falsely claimed I was experiencing paranoid delusions, rendering me a direct existential threat to the operational safety of the medical supply chains we managed. We are on the verge of finalizing our fourth quarter expansion contracts. Jonathan continued, placing a hand over his heart to sell the performance. We cannot have a majority shareholder making destructive financial decisions based on hallucinations. Just yesterday, she locked me out of our personal accounts without provocation. She is a danger to herself, to our infant son, and to the survival of this enterprise. Audrey nodded solemnly from her seat, dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. We just want her to get better, she whispered, her voice laced with venomous fake sympathy. But the company must be protected during her absence. Jonathan pulled out the specific governance charter he believed shielded him. He had spent the last few months quietly shifting executive titles and burying new bylaws in routine compliance updates, convinced those minor maneuvers diluted my founder leverage. He pointed to a highlighted section in the charter. I am formally petitioning this board to invoke the Emergency Medical Incapacitation Clause. I request an immediate vote to indefinitely suspend Sabrina's voting rights, transferring interim control of her shares to the executive committee. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired investor whose offshore portfolios I had already investigated, wiped a bead of sweat from his temple. He was terrified of the public relations nightmare Audrey had unleashed. He wanted the scandal buried swiftly before the stock price plummeted. He adjusted his glasses, looking away from my piercing gaze. Given the severity of the provided medical documentation and the escalating media crisis, the chairman stammered, his voice betraying his cowardice. I call for an immediate vote. All those in favor of temporarily suspending the preferred voting shares to protect corporate assets indicate by raising your hand. Without a single moment of hesitation or debate, 6 hands went up in unison. It was a swift-bought and paid-for betrayal. The men who had profited immensely from my algorithms chose to protect their own wealth over seeking the truth. Jonathan let out a long, shaky breath, playing the relieved savior flawlessly. He slowly sat back down in his high-backed leather chair. A smug, triumphant smirk stretched across his face, breaking through his mask of sorrow. He looked at me from across the long, dark table, his eyes shining with victorious arrogance. He genuinely believed the execution was over. He thought the legal paperwork he filed last quarter, combined with this cowardly vote, permanently severed my connection to the empire. He thought he had just legally stolen my company in broad daylight. I did not object. I did not shout that the psychiatric records were blatant forgeries. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my sanity or beg the board to reconsider. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch out across the boardroom, letting their false sense of victory settle deep into their bones. I unbuttoned my wool trench coat, letting it drape effortlessly over an empty chair. I walked slowly toward the head of the obsidian table, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm. Nathan followed closely, carrying the black leather folder, radiating the quiet menace of a loaded weapon. I stopped directly next to the central projection console built into the table. I unclasped my structured tote bag and pulled out my encrypted tablet, along with a braided connector cable. The board has acted with remarkable efficiency today, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a diamond blade. Your dedication to the corporate bylaws is truly inspiring. So inspiring, in fact, that I think we should review the original founding documents together right now. I plugged the connector into the central console. The massive digital screen covering the wall behind Jonathan instantly flickered to life. I was preparing to drop the financial guillotine, but a cornered thief always has one final trick hidden up their sleeve. The high-resolution screen spanning the wall behind Jonathan flickered to life. I did not project a passionate defense of my mental health or a desperate plea for the board to reconsider their hasty vote. Instead, a highly classified legal document illuminated the room. It was the original founding charter of our healthcare logistics firm. I had drafted this exact contract alongside Nathan 5 years ago, long before the company occupied a glass tower in the financial district. I tapped the screen of my tablet, highlighting a deeply buried section of the text in bright yellow. It was a strict morality and embezzlement clause, a failsafe I mandated to protect my initial capital investments from executive misconduct. Jonathan stared at the glowing yellow text, the color beginning to recede from his confident face. He had spent months manipulating recent bylaws, but he had entirely forgotten the bedrock rules of his own employment contract. Nathan stepped forward to the edge of the obsidian conference table. He did not utter a single word. He simply opened his sleek black leather folder and began distributing thick dossiers to every director in the room. The heavy thud of crisp paper hitting the polished glass echoed in the quiet space. The executives opened the files hesitantly, their eyes scanning the top pages. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I walked slowly down the length of the table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the hardwood floor. I instructed the terrified investors to look past the forged psychiatric evaluations Jonathan had just presented. I guided their attention to the raw, unfiltered financial ledgers they now held in their hands. I explained that, while they thought they were voting to protect the enterprise from an unstable mother, they had actually been manipulated into covering up a staggering corporate heist. I detailed the anatomy of the theft. I pointed out the name of the dummy corporation Apex Solutions. I instructed them to look at the registration documents proving Audrey was the managing director of the shell entity. I read the wire transfer amounts out loud so there could be no deniability. I listed the hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned from our vital research and development fund, funneled under the guise of offshore holding accounts and phantom consulting fees. Then I delivered the undisputed centerpiece of the forensic autopsy. I instructed the board to turn to the final page of their dossiers. It was the digital receipt for a $2 million luxury penthouse overlooking the Schuylkill River. I explained the forensic internet protocol trace. I detailed how the network query bounced through regional cellular towers and pinged directly back to the specific smartphone currently resting in Jonathan's tailored pocket. The chairman of the board let out a sharp, audible gasp. The remaining color drained from his wrinkled face, leaving him looking hollow and terrified. He dropped the paperwork onto the table as if the pages were burning his hands. The other directors stared at the ledgers in profound horror. They possessed enough business acumen to realize the grave mistake they had just made. By hastily voting to suspend my voting rights to shield Jonathan, they had legally aligned themselves with an active federal crime. They were now accessories to wire fraud. Panic erupted in the soundproof boardroom. The venture capitalists began shouting over one another, desperate to retract their votes and distance themselves from the catastrophic liability sitting at the head of the table. The chairman demanded Jonathan step down immediately or face a criminal referral to the authorities. The chaos was suddenly silenced. Audrey stood up from her leather chair. She smoothed the front of her conservative dress, her demeanor shifting from fake sympathy to cold, calculating survival. She reached into the deep pocket of her skirt and retrieved a sleek silver flash drive. She held it up high, allowing the fluorescent lights to catch the metallic surface. She announced with a piercing, authoritative voice that the financial ledgers did not matter anymore. Audrey informed the terrified room that she had successfully migrated the core predictive algorithms onto that specific drive. She claimed she initiated a total wipe of the central corporate servers just before this emergency meeting began. The billion-dollar technology that powered every lucrative contract the enterprise held rested solely in the palm of her hand. She stepped toward the data port embedded in the center of the conference table and plugged the small device into the terminal. The massive projection screen behind her flickered, dropping my financial documents and turning a hostile, blinding red. A system lockdown notification blared across the monitor in bold white letters. A suffocating silence fell over the executives. Jonathan regained his footing, his posture straightened, and that smug, familiar smirk returned to his face. He stepped forward, relishing the visible fear in the eyes of the board members. He gloated that the company was now a hostage. He laid out their extortion demands with ruthless clarity. The board must immediately authorize the transfer of all remaining liquid assets to the Delaware Shell Company. Furthermore, they must draft an ironclad immunity agreement shielding him and Audrey from any internal investigations or legal repercussions. Audrey tapped the silver flash drive with a manicured fingernail. She warned the investors that if they refused to comply, she would snap the drive in half. She threatened to permanently destroy the proprietary software, a move that would instantly bankrupt every single man in the room and send their stock portfolios crashing to zero before the market even opened. For 60 agonizing seconds, the defeat felt tangible. The executives looked completely broken. The chairman lowered his head, seemingly ready to capitulate to save his vast fortune. Jonathan crossed his arms, looking down at me with pure, victorious disdain. He thought his brute force extortion had conquered my quiet intellect. He believed he had successfully cornered the architect in her own house. I looked at the glaring red screen, then down at my encrypted tablet. I did not summon security. I simply looked at the woman who used to be my closest confidant. I spoke directly to Audrey. My voice was soft, carrying a lethal calm that made the surrounding directors hold their breath. I reminded her of the late nights we spent in my cramped apartment years ago. I described the smell of stale coffee and the hum of cheap cooling fans as I taught her the foundational basics of network architecture. I reminded her that I lifted her out of poverty and trained her to navigate complex server interfaces. I praised her for being a fast learner. I admitted her extortion plan was brilliantly structured. But I offered one final crucial lesson. I told her that a student only wields the power the teacher chooses to share. I informed her that I never granted her master administrative rights. She never had root access to the external drives she thought she securely configured. Her confident sneer faltered. Her hand hovered nervously over the connected flash drive. I looked down at my tablet. My fingers tapped 3 specific commands across the glass screen. I pressed the Enter key. A high-pitched electronic chime rang out from the central console. The blinding red lockdown warning on the massive screen shifted instantly. The text changed, rendering a new glaring message in a bold, undeniable font. Wiped. Audrey let out a startled cry. She hammered her fingers frantically against the tabletop keyboard, desperate to access the root directories. There was nothing left to find. The digital architecture of her external drive had been scrubbed down to its bare bones. I stood tall, adjusting the lapels of my wool trench coat. I announced to the paralyzed room that the master code was never in danger. The moment Audrey plugged her device into the mainframe to steal the data, the hardware automatically synced with my hidden ghost protocol. The proprietary algorithms instantly recalled themselves to my private biometric vault. The automated security tether executed a complete wipe of her external device. The sleek silver flash drive she held was now nothing more than a useless piece of empty metal. The leverage evaporated into the sterile boardroom air. The extortion attempt crumbled into dust. Audrey stared at the glowing red error message, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Jonathan realized his ultimate victory was nothing but a calculated illusion. The sudden loss of power left them entirely exposed, surrounded by furious investors who now recognized them not as brilliant masterminds, but as cornered, desperate thieves who had just run out of places to hide. The glaring red error message reflecting off the dark obsidian table marked the exact second the illusion shattered. Audrey stared at the dead monitor. The silver flash drive hanging from the data port was now a useless trinket. The suffocating reality of her situation settled over her shoulders like a lead shroud. There was no leverage left in her hand. There was only a crisp paper trail leading directly to a federal indictment. Growing up, navigating the precarious edges of poverty in a fractured home, Audrey learned early that loyalty was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Survival meant knowing exactly when to abandon a sinking ship. She possessed a fierce intellect, utilizing her charm to climb out of destitution, but she lacked the moral anchor required to sustain true success. Audrey stumbled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor. Her survival instincts kicked into overdrive, overriding any lingering affection she harbored for the man standing beside her. She turned her gaze toward the furious board members, then locked eyes with the chairman. "He orchestrated the entire scheme," Audrey shrieked, pointing a trembling, perfectly manicured finger directly at Jonathan. Her voice cracked, shedding its cultured corporate polish, revealing the desperate, terrified woman underneath. "He forced me to register the shell entity under my name. He forged the research and development funding requests. I was just following direct orders from my superior." Jonathan whipped his head around, his eyes widening in profound shock. The stoic, unbothered persona he had meticulously cultivated for the past hour evaporated into thin air. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but Audrey refused to yield the floor. She played the role of the coerced subordinate flawlessly. Weeping and claiming Jonathan promised to make her chief executive officer if she merely signed the incorporation documents for the dummy corporation. She swore to the panicked investors that she was manipulated by a powerful leader. I remained seated, observing the pathetic spectacle. A cornered rat will always bite its own tail to escape a trap. I tapped my encrypted tablet one more time. The glowing red error message on the main projection wall vanished, replaced by a series of high-resolution screenshots. These were the decrypted external communications I had extracted from Audrey's hidden server folders hours earlier. I did not need to raise my voice to regain control of the room. I simply let the undeniable documents speak for themselves. The text messages and emails spanned across the sweeping screen. They detailed Audrey's covert negotiations with the rival Boston biotech conglomerate. The board members squinted at the projected text, reading her explicit instructions to route the stolen patent purchase funds into decentralized offshore accounts solely under her control. But the most damning paragraph rested at the bottom of the correspondence. Audrey had detailed a meticulous framing mechanism designed to leave Jonathan holding the bag when the authorities eventually discovered the missing capital. Jonathan stared at the glowing white text. He read the words written by the woman he had destroyed our family to protect. The realization struck him with devastating force. He had thrown away a devoted wife, a brilliant business partner, and a comfortable existence for a mistress who viewed him as a disposable scapegoat. Before he wore custom Italian suits, Jonathan grew up in the gritty industrial sector of Philadelphia. He spent his youth fighting for scraps, desperate to mask his blue-collar roots with expensive cologne and rehearsed boardroom etiquette. In this single moment, every ounce of that polished refinement was stripped away. A narcissist can endure losing capital. They can even endure losing a boardroom vote. But they can never endure being played for a fool by someone they considered their inferior. His composure fractured into jagged, irreparable pieces. A guttural roar tore from his throat. Jonathan lunged across the narrow space separating them. The movement was so sudden and feral that the nearest venture capitalist recoiled in terror, knocking over a ceramic coffee mug. The dark liquid spilled across the important financial dossiers. Jonathan grabbed the collar of Audrey's conservative dress. The sheer force of his grip tore the fabric, a sharp ripping sound echoing through the soundproof room. Her designer sleeve tore at the seam, exposing her shoulder as she shrieked in genuine terror. He shook her screaming vicious insults right into her face. Spit flew from his lips, landing on her cheek as he unleashed a torrent of unhinged rage. He called her a parasite, a pathetic thief who would still be drowning in medical debt if he had not elevated her to the executive suite. He conveniently forgot that my checkbook had saved her life, inserting himself as her savior, even in his darkest moment. Audrey scratched wildly at his hands, her manicured nails leaving deep red tracks across the back of his knuckles. They were a chaotic, pathetic mess of betrayal and desperation, destroying each other over the ashes of their stolen empire. I reached across the table and picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water. I took a slow, refreshing sip. The carbonation danced on my tongue. I watched the poetic justice unfold with a sense of cold, clinical satisfaction. Nathan stood right behind my chair, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He did not intervene. He let Jonathan reveal his true, feral nature to the very men who had just voted to protect him. The distinguished director's men who had bought into my husband's calm genius persona were now watching a volatile, dangerous man physically assault his own chief operating officer over a foiled embezzlement scheme. The chairman slammed his fist against the obsidian table, his face flushed with outrage and raw fear. He shouted for security, pressing the emergency panic button installed beneath the conference lip. The heavy glass doors of the penthouse suite burst open. 4 broad-shouldered security guards rushed inside. They grabbed Jonathan by the arms, wrestling him off a hysterically sobbing Audrey. Jonathan thrashed against their grip, his tailored suit jacket ripping at the seams, his dark hair falling wildly over his forehead. "Get your hands off me!" Jonathan spat, struggling fiercely against the guards as they twisted his arms behind his back. "I am the leader of this enterprise. I built this empire." The chairman stood up, pointing a trembling finger at the disgraced executive. "You are a thief and a profound liability," the chairman yelled back. The unanimous support Jonathan had orchestrated just minutes ago was now a distant memory. The guards began dragging him backward toward the open glass doors, his expensive leather shoes scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Audrey remained collapsed on the floor, clutching her torn dress, weeping as the board members looked at her with pure disgust. She had saved herself from his physical grasp, but her corporate career was effectively incinerated. As Jonathan was forced across the threshold, the realization that he had just lost his title, his company, and his pristine reputation finally registered in his hollow eyes. He locked his gaze onto mine from across the room. He saw me sitting there, unbothered, holding the reins of the empire he thought he owned. His fear morphed into pure vindictive malice. He dug his heels into the polished concrete hallway, fighting the guards just long enough to scream one final desperate threat. "You think you won, Sabrina?" His voice cracked with feral hysteria echoing down the corridor. "I am still your husband. I still have marital rights. I will drag this divorce out for a decade in family court. I will take half of everything you own." The heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off his frantic screaming. The boardroom plunged into a heavy, stunned silence. The directors stared at the empty space where their golden boy had just been hauled away in disgrace. I slowly set my glass of sparkling water down on the table, the condensation leaving a perfect ring on the obsidian surface. Jonathan believed the battle for his wealth would be fought in family court, under the standard community property laws of Pennsylvania. He assumed he could bleed me dry through endless litigation. He was about to discover that Nathan and I had already rigged that specific game 10 years ago, long before this war even began. Less than 48 hours after security dragged my husband from the corporate penthouse, we met on neutral ground to negotiate the terms of his surrender. The arbitration suite occupied the 35th floor of a sleek downtown Philadelphia high-rise. It was a sterile space, composed entirely of cold chrome and frosted glass, designed specifically for high net worth individuals who preferred to dissect their broken marriages in private rather than bleed in a public courtroom. Jonathan sat across the long, transparent conference table. He had swapped his ruined navy jacket for a fresh charcoal suit, projecting an aura of undisturbed confidence. Beside him slouched a notorious divorce attorney, known throughout the state for turning family court disputes into agonizing media spectacles. This hired gun wore an ostentatious pinstripe ensemble and possessed a manufactured sleaze that seemed to ooze from his pores. He held a heavy gold-plated pen, tapping the metallic tip rhythmically against the glass surface. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was designed to irritate, a cheap psychological tactic meant to fluster the opposition before the negotiations even began. My husband looked surprisingly relaxed for a man recently exposed as a federal thief. He genuinely believed that because Pennsylvania functioned under equitable distribution principles, the family court system would force a vast division of my wealth. Furthermore, he operated under the dangerous assumption that the recent executive restructuring maneuvers he orchestrated had successfully bypassed the original legal safeguards of our union. He thought he possessed untouchable leverage. The sleazy attorney cleared his throat and launched into a theatrical opening monologue. He spoke at length about the decade-long duration of our union, detailing Jonathan's supposed immense contributions to the logistic algorithms that made our firm profitable. The lawyer painted a grim picture of a protracted trial, threatening to drag my name and my newly reclaimed enterprise through the mud if we did not capitulate to their terms immediately. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and delivered the staggering ultimatum. He demanded $500 million in immediate liquid settlement funds, plus primary physical custody of my son Wyatt. Nathan sat beside me, radiating the calm stillness of a predator waiting for its prey to wander directly into the kill zone. My brother did not interrupt the pompous speech. He allowed the attorney to talk himself into a corner, letting the heavy silence stretch out to make the opposition sweat. True authority never needs to shout or interrupt. When the gold pen finally stopped tapping, Nathan reached into his structured leather briefcase. He bypassed the thick folders containing recent financial audits and forensic accounting reports. Instead, he withdrew a single, neatly bound document. The edges of the paper were slightly yellowed, with age bearing the distinct marks of a contract stored away for a decade. Nathan slid the vintage agreement smoothly across the pristine glass table until it rested right in front of Jonathan. A decade ago, Jonathan was just an ambitious logistics manager from the gritty industrial sector of the city, desperate to launch a supply chain startup that ultimately failed. I was a quiet software developer, secretly building my first highly lucrative biotech venture. Before we walked down the aisle, Jonathan had eagerly insisted on drafting a prenuptial agreement. His ego convinced him he would eventually become a prominent billionaire, and he viewed me as a naive liability, seeking a free ride on his future coattails. He wanted to shield his imaginary riches. I had agreed to sign the paperwork, provided Nathan drafted the final specific terms. Blinded by his own hubris, Jonathan barely skimmed the final pages before signing his name on the dotted line. Nathan tapped his index finger against page 34, subsection C. He read the text aloud, his deep baritone voice cutting through the sterile room. It was an incredibly specific, deeply buried, ironclad fraud and infidelity forfeiture clause. The language explicitly stated that if either party committed proven adultery or engaged in any form of financial sabotage against the other, they immediately and permanently forfeited all rights to spousal support, all claims to shared business equity, and all marital assets acquired during the duration of the marriage. The hired attorney scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in the air. He leaned back in his chair, claiming such archaic clauses were notoriously difficult to enforce in modern courts without irrefutable concrete proof. Nathan did not argue the point. He simply reached back into his briefcase and placed a specialized digital audio player on the glass table, alongside printed copies of the Apex Solutions shell company ledgers. I pressed the play button. The crystal clear audio from the hidden security cameras in our mainline estate study filled the arbitration suite. Jonathan's unmistakable, arrogant voice echoed off the frosted glass panels, demanding I accept his illicit arrangement with Audrey or face financial ruin. The recording captured his cruel ultimatums and the undeniable sounds of their betrayal. Nathan then tapped the stack of financial ledgers, reminding the opposition that we also held digital proof of federal wire fraud and systemic embezzlement. The blood drained from Jonathan's face, leaving his complexion the color of dirty ash. His arrogant posture collapsed, his shoulders slumping, as the devastating reality of his signature washed over him. He looked toward his high-priced lawyer, his eyes wide and frantic, silently begging for a miraculous legal loophole to save him from ruin. But the attorney was a mercenary who only fought battles he could win and profit from. The man recognized a flawless legal fortress when he saw one. He stared at the yellowed contract, then glanced at the wire fraud ledgers in the audio device. Aiding a client attempting to extort $500 million while actively confessing to federal crimes on tape was a swift, unalterable path to disbarment. The sleazy lawyer stopped tapping his gold pen. He snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. He stood up, looking down at Jonathan with profound professional disdain. He muttered that they had zero legal ground to stand on, announced his immediate resignation as legal counsel, and walked out of the suite without a single backward glance. Jonathan sat alone at his side of the long, transparent table. The crushing weight of the situation pinned him to his chair. He was legally entitled to exactly 0 cents. He was walking away from a 10-year marriage and a billion-dollar tech empire with nothing but the clothes on his back and a looming federal indictment hovering over his head. Stripped of his imaginary wealth and abandoned by his own counsel, his shock rapidly mutated into feral, unadulterated hatred. He shoved his chair back so forcefully it crashed to the floor, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet room. Knowing he could no longer fight me in the boardroom or the arbitration suite, he stormed out of the glass doors, his footsteps pounding down the corridor. But a cornered rat never stops fighting when its survival is threatened. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket as he marched toward the elevators, dialing a specific contact. He was about to drag our war out of the shadows and ignite a public firestorm right on my front lawn. The descent from the arbitration suite felt like passing through the quiet eye of a hurricane. The polished steel elevator doors glided shut, leaving the disgraced lawyer and his discarded client on the 35th floor. Nathan stood beside me, his briefcase resting against his knee. We both knew the war was far from over. A narcissist stripped of his financial leverage will always seek a different battlefield. Jonathan had dialed his phone the moment he stormed out of the conference room. He was calling the media contacts Audrey had meticulously curated over the years, aiming to weaponize the press and litigate our divorce in the court of public opinion. As the elevator reached the ground level, the sprawling glass lobby of the Philadelphia high-rise offered a clear view of the plaza outside. The crisp autumn wind whipped down the urban corridor, carrying the distant wail of a passing ambulance. Gathered just beyond the revolving doors was a swarming cluster of local news crews, syndicated broadcast vans, and independent journalists. The flashing strobe of camera lights fractured the afternoon shadows, painting the concrete courtyard in harsh bursts of blinding white illumination. Jonathan had beaten us to the street level by utilizing the service stairs. He was already positioned near the decorative stone pillars flanking the building entrance, gripping a metal barricade with both hands. He was delivering an Oscar-worthy performance. Tears streamed down his cheeks, catching the glare of the halogen lamps. He played the role of the alienated, devastated father to perfection. He spoke to the thrusting microphones with a trembling voice, painting a tragic portrait of a concerned husband trying to protect his infant son from a spouse suffering a severe psychological breakdown. He begged the cameras for privacy while simultaneously feeding the reporters every sensational detail Audrey had scripted for him. The journalists devoured the narrative, their digital recorders capturing every fabricated sob. They believed they were documenting the tragic collapse of a prominent healthcare logistics family. I pushed through the revolving glass doors, stepping onto the concrete plaza. The cold wind caught the hem of my wool trench coat. The moment the press spotted me, the chaotic mob shifted their focus. A tidal wave of reporters surged forward, shouting overlapping questions about postpartum psychosis and corporate instability. Nathan moved seamlessly to my right side, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable barrier against the encroaching cameras. He did not shove the reporters or raise his voice. His imposing presence alone forced the front line of journalists to halt their advance. I did not shrink away from the flashing strobes. I did not hide my face behind my hands or shout desperate denials. A person telling the truth never needs to yell. I walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the large stone pillar situated just a few feet from where Jonathan stood. The press tracked my every movement, their camera shutters firing in a relentless, frantic rhythm. Nathan placed his leather briefcase onto the flat surface of the pillar and popped the brass latches. He withdrew a sleek, cylindrical, portable Bluetooth speaker, setting it upright on the cold stone. The murmurs of the crowd grew confused as I retrieved my smartphone from my pocket. I tapped the screen, pairing the device to the speaker. I turned to face the sea of journalists. I spoke in a clear, steady tone, instructing the reporters to stop asking fabricated questions and listen to the unvarnished reality of the situation. I pressed the play icon on my screen. The crystal-clear audio recording sliced through the crisp Pennsylvania air. The volume was dialed to its maximum limit, allowing the voices to reverberate against the glass exterior of the surrounding skyscrapers. The broadcast began with the security footage from the soundproof boardroom earlier that morning. Jonathan's distinct, arrogant voice boomed from the speaker, no longer weeping or playing the victim. The crowd heard his feral, unhinged rage. They heard the sickening sound of tearing fabric as he physically assaulted Audrey, screaming vicious insults and calling her a parasite. The recording seamlessly transitioned into the financial discussions we had captured. The journalists listened in stunned fascination as Jonathan and Audrey explicitly detailed their coordinated scheme to embezzle millions of dollars from the vital research and development fund of our healthcare enterprise. The audio laid out the offshore routing numbers the dummy corporation registered in Delaware and the $2 million luxury penthouse purchased with stolen capital. The chaotic shouting of the media mob ceased instantly. A profound, deafening silence fell over the plaza, broken only by the whistling wind. A veteran reporter standing in the front row loosened her grip in sheer shock, allowing her leather-bound notepad to slip from her fingers. The booklet hit the concrete with a soft thud. The journalists realized they were not covering a tragic family dispute. They were broadcasting a live confession to a staggering federal wire fraud conspiracy. Across the city, Audrey was undoubtedly monitoring the live news feeds from her temporary sanctuary. She had spent her entire adult life studying the mechanics of public relations, learning how to spin corporate disasters into triumphs. She built her pristine reputation on controlling the narrative, manipulating headlines to protect elite executives from their own terrible decisions. Now, sitting before a television screen, she was forced to watch her own career burn to ash on a syndicated live broadcast. There was no spin room clever enough to erase the sound of her own voice plotting to steal millions of dollars and frame her lover. Her professional existence was permanently incinerated in front of the entire state. The camera lenses pivoted away from me, swinging like the turrets of a battleship to lock directly onto Jonathan. The flashing strobes erupted with renewed intensity, capturing his total public ruin. He stood frozen by the metal barricade, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The fake tears, drying on his cheeks, now looked pathetic and hollow. The arrogant logistics titan was stripped bare, exposed as a violent, desperate thief on live television. The paralysis shattered as the reporters surged toward him, thrusting their microphones forward, demanding answers about the embezzlement and the physical assault. The sheer pressure of the media onslaught broke his final shred of composure. Jonathan turned his back on the cameras, shoving his way past a stunned cameraman. He sprinted down the pavement toward a waiting black town car he had hired earlier. He threw himself into the back seat, slamming the door shut as the vehicle sped away into the afternoon traffic. He was fleeing the scene, but his escape route was already predetermined. A man stripped of his corporate power and facing imminent criminal exposure will always run toward his hidden assets. His desperate flight was leading him directly into the snare I had set 8 months prior, moving the final piece of the chessboard into the exact position I required. The interior of the vehicle offered a quiet sanctuary away from the flashing cameras and shouting reporters swarming the downtown plaza. Nathan navigated the sprawling Philadelphia traffic with the calm precision of a man who had already secured his victory, steering our vehicle onto the southbound lanes of Interstate 95. We left the chaotic media spectacle behind, but the pursuit was far from over. A predator stripped of its territory will invariably run toward its hidden reserves, and I knew exactly where Jonathan intended to go. Years ago, during the infancy of our marriage, my husband presented me with a brand new smartphone. He had taken the liberty of configuring the device before handing it over, framing his actions as an expression of profound devotion. He claimed my status as the heiress to a prominent biotech fortune made me a target, insisting that a shared family location application was a necessary precaution. He disguised his inherent need for control under a veneer of protective affection. I recognized the surveillance tactic immediately, yet I allowed him to retain his illusion of dominance. I never uninstalled the software. Today, that arrogant assumption of power became the instrument of his downfall. I rested my tablet on my lap, watching a small digital indicator pulse on the high-resolution map. The beacon moved steadily along the highway, broadcasting the exact coordinates of the rental car Jonathan had commandeered. He was heading straight for Philadelphia International Airport. More specifically, the digital marker bypassed the bustling commercial hubs and turned toward the secluded private aviation pavilion. Despite the vicious physical altercation in the corporate boardroom just hours earlier, Jonathan and Audrey were fleeing together. The pristine facade of their grand romance had perished amid torn silk and shouted insults, replaced by a toxic mutual resentment. Yet the staggering weight of their shared crimes bound them in a wretched, unavoidable alliance. The domestic banking infrastructure was entirely closed off to them. Their professional reputations were ash. Their sole remaining lifeline was the decentralized offshore wealth hidden within the Cayman Islands. They needed each other to bypass the dual authentication protocols Audrey had established for the dummy corporation. Greed forged a chain neither of them could break. The Cayman Islands offer far more than scenic beaches and luxury resorts. The territory provides an impenetrable fortress for illicit capital. The stringent banking secrecy laws restrict foreign investigations, making the region a favored sanctuary for disgraced executives seeking to vanish. Jonathan firmly believed that if he could simply step onto a private charter and touch down on Caribbean soil, he could liquidate the stolen assets, sever his ties to American jurisdiction, and disappear into comfortable anonymity. Nathan kept our vehicle a safe distance behind the rental car. His eyes focused on the winding access roads. He asked in a low, steady tone if we should contact local law enforcement to intercept them before they reached the tarmac. I shook my head, keeping my gaze fixed on the pulsing digital map. Municipal police departments handle domestic disputes and local infractions. They do not possess the sweeping authority required to untangle an international corporate espionage ring. My retaliation was designed to be far more permanent than a local holding cell. Federal prosecutors do not build their cases on mere suspicion or emotional testimony. They construct their indictments on undeniable arithmetic. 8 months prior, while Jonathan slept soundly in our master suite, I compiled a comprehensive dossier detailing his fractional financial anomalies. I submitted a formal, heavily encrypted whistleblower package directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The authorities had been building a silent, meticulous case ever since tracking the phantom transactions and offshore routing numbers. However, a white-collar conviction requires a definitive link connecting the stolen capital to the individual perpetrator. The authorities needed a smoking gun. By logging into the dummy account to purchase the luxury penthouse on a personal, traceable device this morning, Jonathan provided the final required keystone. His network location was the digital fingerprint a federal magistrate needed to sign the immediate arrest warrants. We pulled into the designated loading zone of the private aviation terminal, the engine idling in the cool autumn air. I tapped a command on my tablet, linking into the secure surveillance feed provided by Nathan's network of federal contacts. The screen illuminated, displaying the interior of the exclusive lounge. The private pavilion catered specifically to those who treated air travel as a luxury event rather than a logistical chore. Muted ambient lighting bathed the room designed to soothe frayed executive nerves. Waitstaff circulated across the thick carpets, carrying trays of sparkling cider and hors d'oeuvres. The heavy revolving glass doors spun, and Jonathan entered the sanctuary, followed closely by Audrey. They looked haggard and exhausted. Their designer clothing was wrinkled, and they carried hastily packed leather duffels. They scanned the tranquil room, their tense shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch as they mistakenly believed they had outrun the impending storm. They thought they had outsmarted the system. I watched through the digital feed as Jonathan approached the polished marble check-in counter. He ran a hand through his disheveled dark hair, attempting to project his usual commanding aura. He offered the young concierge a tight, practiced smile, sliding 2 navy blue passports across the smooth stone surface. He requested immediate runway clearance for their chartered flight, tapping his fingers impatiently against the counter. The concierge, dressed in a crisp airline uniform, took the documents and swiped the first passport through her specialized digital reader. A sharp, piercing beep shattered the quiet atmosphere of the lounge. The monitor facing the concierge flared with a stark, crimson warning notification. The young woman frowned, her professional smile faltering. She tapped her keyboard, assuming the system had encountered a routine technical glitch. She picked up the second passport and swiped it through the magnetic slot. Another undeniable beep of rejection echoed through the room. Jonathan slapped his palm flat against the marble, his voice rising in volume as he demanded priority processing and threatened to have the young woman fired. He never finished his arrogant sentence. The sweeping glass entrance doors of the terminal hissed open. A highly coordinated tactical unit surged into the luxurious lobby. They did not wear the standard blue uniforms of municipal officers. These agents wore dark, weather-resistant windbreakers, the stark yellow lettering of Homeland Security and the Internal Revenue Service emblazoned across their broad backs. They were seasoned operatives from the Financial Crimes Division, executing a meticulous federal sweep. They moved with silent, lethal efficiency, bypassing the velvet ropes and converging directly on the check-in desk. Jonathan turned around, his loud protests dying instantly in his throat. His eyes widened in stark, unadulterated terror as the reality of the windbreakers registered in his mind. Before he could take a single step backward, an agent gripped his shoulder, spinning him around with practiced force. The operative pressed Jonathan's chest firmly against the cold marble counter, pinning him in place. The crisp, metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut resonated through the hushed pavilion, securing his wrist tightly behind his back. Audrey shrieked, dropping her expensive leather duffel bag onto the floor. A female agent moved in swiftly, securing her arms and forcing her against the adjacent paneled wall. The click of a second set of handcuffs finalized her capture. Their designer luggage was immediately seized by additional personnel, tagged on the spot as primary evidence in a staggering wire fraud conspiracy. The wealthy patrons populating the elite lounge lowered their champagne flutes, staring in rapt fascination. The once untouchable healthcare logistics titan was humiliated in public, stripped of his dignity and his freedom in front of his peers. He was dragged away from the counter, his expensive shoes stumbling over the plush carpet as the federal agents escorted him toward the waiting transport vehicles outside. I lowered my tablet, the screen fading to black. The physical arrest was a profound victory, but it merely served as the opening salvo of the federal justice system. Jonathan would soon find himself standing before a magistrate, where a staggering flight risk designation would demand exorbitant bail conditions. He would be forced to seek salvation from the very people whose reputations he had just destroyed, compelling his enablers to leverage their own futures to secure his temporary freedom. Meanwhile, Audrey would be placed in a freezing concrete interrogation room. Facing the prospect of spending the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary, her survival instincts would inevitably take control. She would search for a way to save herself, calculating the exact price required to trade her former lover for a taste of criminal immunity. The concrete walls of the federal detention center seemed to radiate a bone-chilling cold, absorbing the sparse warmth of the barren interrogation room. Audrey sat alone, staring at the scarred surface of a cheap metal table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a relentless mechanical hum, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across her exhausted features. She had been stripped of her designer blazer, her silk blouse wrinkled and clinging to her shivering frame. The rough texture of the metal chair served as a stark physical reminder of her sudden plunge from the corporate elite to a federal inmate. For years, Audrey had thrived by anticipating the next move of her adversaries. She built a lucrative career managing public relations crises, spinning catastrophic failures into triumphant comeback stories. She understood the psychology of powerful men better than anyone in the industry. Sitting in that frigid room, her survival instincts engaged with lethal clarity. She knew exactly how Jonathan would play his defense strategy. A narcissist cornered by the government always searches for a convenient target to absorb the blame. He would point his finger squarely at her. He would claim the chief operating officer went rogue, utilizing her administrative access to siphon research funds without his knowledge. He would frame her as a greedy subordinate who manipulated his trust, offering her up as a sacrificial lamb to save his own skin. Audrey traced the rim of a paper water cup on her mind, calculating the arithmetic of her survival. In the ruthless ecosystem they inhabited, loyalty was an illusion, sold to the naive. When the heavy steel door finally opened, a seasoned prosecutor from the Department of Justice stepped inside, accompanied by a lead investigator holding a thick binder filled with the forensic ledgers I had provided. The federal agent sat across from her, laying out the undeniable evidence of the dummy corporation registered under her name. He presented the wire transfer receipts, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital footprint connecting her to the stolen millions. He spoke in a flat monotone, painting a grim portrait of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Audrey did not weep. She did not waste precious time proclaiming her innocence or begging for a merciful arrangement. She looked the prosecutor dead in the eye and demanded a formal proffer session. She spoke with the clinical detachment of a woman negotiating a hostile corporate takeover. She informed the government that, while her signature appeared on the incorporation documents, she was merely the instrument of a much larger conspiracy. She offered them the architect. Audrey laid out her terms, refusing to utter another syllable until an ironclad immunity agreement rested on the cheap metal table. The prosecutor recognized the immense value of her cooperation. The authorities always preferred to capture the corrupt mastermind rather than settle for the accomplice. Within 2 hours, a formal legal document was drafted. Audrey picked up a standard blue ballpoint pen and signed a comprehensive immunity affidavit. In that sworn statement, she detailed every single one of Jonathan's illicit directives. She documented how he orchestrated the embezzlement, how he mandated the creation of the shell entity, and how he personally authorized the transfer of the stolen research capital to purchase the luxury penthouse. She traded the man she supposedly loved for her own freedom, securing her criminal immunity while simultaneously sealing his 20-year prison sentence. While Audrey secured her survival, Jonathan faced a drastically different reality in a neighboring federal courthouse. He stood before a stern magistrate judge wearing a wrinkled suit and an expression of profound disbelief. The prosecution highlighted his arrest at a private aviation pavilion with a one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands, successfully arguing that the disgraced logistics executive posed an extreme flight risk. The judge struck the gavel with finality, setting bail at a staggering $10 million. Jonathan was granted a single phone call from the holding cells. He possessed no allies left in the financial sector. His venture capitalist friends had vanished the moment the audio recording aired on live television, treating his name like a contagion. His only remaining lifeline was a woman blinded by maternal devotion and desperate delusion. He dialed his mother. Patricia sat in the darkened living room of her sprawling suburban estate, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight to block the flashing lenses of the paparazzi camped on her sidewalk. Her prestigious reputation lay in ruins. The country club associates who once clamored for invitations to her charity galas now refused to answer her calls, treating her as a pariah following her accidental hot mic confession. Furthermore, the estate itself was crumbling under the weight of imminent foreclosure notices as the financial freeze I initiated rippled through their interconnected accounts. When the telephone rang, she snatched the receiver, listening to her golden child beg for salvation. Jonathan pleaded with her, insisting the entire scandal was a profound misunderstanding, engineered by a vindictive wife. He promised he could fix everything, clear their family name, and restore their wealth, if he could just get out of a jail cell to mount a proper legal defense. Patricia believed him, because facing the reality of her son's monstrous nature was too agonizing a burden to bear. She did not possess $10 million in liquid cash, but she held the physical deed to her sprawling historic property. Driven by a frantic need to rescue her son, she contacted a high-risk bail bondsman known for exploiting desperate, wealthy families. The shady operator arrived at her residence under the cover of darkness, presenting a stack of complex legal contracts. Patricia did not consult an attorney. She did not read the fine print detailing the exorbitant interest rates or the immediate forfeiture clauses that would transfer ownership of the distressed asset directly to the bondsman upon default. She simply signed her name, leveraging the last of her assets and mortgaging her beloved home to secure the monumental bond. She tethered her entire financial future to a man whose destiny was already etched in stone. Shortly before midnight, the bureaucratic machinery processed the paperwork. Jonathan was escorted into a sterile processing room on the ground floor of the detention facility. A technician instructed him to roll up the right leg of his trousers. The cold, heavy plastic of a GPS ankle monitor was clamped securely around his calf, the industrial locking mechanism engaging with a sharp, definitive click. The device was bulky, an inescapable physical reminder of his newfound captive status. The technician read the strict conditions of his release in a monotonous drone. Jonathan was mandated to surrender his passport, remain within the geographical boundaries of the county, and was expressly forbidden from initiating any contact with co-defendants or witnesses involved in the federal conspiracy. Jonathan nodded, signing the release forms with a trembling hand. The heavy steel doors of the federal building buzzed open, spilling him out onto the damp pavement of the city streets. The frigid night air bit into his face. He stood on the sidewalk, a disgraced titan reduced to a monitored criminal, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the concrete. He thought he had secured a temporary victory. He believed he could use this fleeting freedom to silence Audrey, coerce her into changing her testimony, and somehow salvage the wreckage of his empire. He had no idea that the woman he was plotting to manipulate had already handed the government the exact blade they needed to execute him. His ego blinded him to the lethal danger he was walking into. Driven by a toxic mixture of panic and vengeance, Jonathan stepped off the curb and hailed a passing taxi, deciding in that fatal instant to violate the most critical condition of his federal bail. He was going to hunt down his former mistress, stepping directly into the final, devastating trap I had prepared for him. The storm cascaded down from the Appalachian ridges, bringing a freezing autumn downpour that slicked the winding mountain roads. Inside the heated cabin of Nathan's tactical SUV, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers kept time with the blinking digital beacon on my tablet screen. Jonathan had leased a cheap sedan under a false name, thinking he could mask his movements from the authorities. He failed to comprehend that the surveillance software anchored deep within his smartphone did not care about aliases or cash transactions. It only cared about coordinates. The digital marker traced his frantic path away from the metropolitan limits, charting a course straight into the desolate rural pockets of Pennsylvania. He was currently breaking the primary mandate of his federal release. The magistrate had ordered him to avoid all contact with co-defendants, yet a man accustomed to manipulating outcomes cannot resist the urge to control a collapsing narrative. Jonathan believed he could corner his former mistress, intimidate her into recanting her testimony, and somehow salvage his shattered existence. He drove blind to the reality that Audrey had already traded his future for her own salvation. He navigated the winding slick asphalt with erratic desperation, a former titan of industry reduced to a fugitive, fleeing in the dead of night. We parked our vehicle in the dense tree line across the street from a dilapidated motor lodge. The Starlight Inn sat isolated on a forgotten stretch of highway, a relic of a bygone era. A flickering neon sign buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pink illumination across the cracked, uneven pavement. Rain gathered in deep potholes, reflecting the harsh artificial light. This was a place meant for transients and runaways, a staggering fall from grace for a woman who yesterday anticipated moving into a luxury penthouse overlooking the Schuylkill River. The piercing screech of tires fractured the quiet night. A gray rental sedan swerved into the lot, braking with erratic force near the far end of the single-story structure. Jonathan shoved the driver door open, stumbling into the torrential rain. He wore the same wrinkled suit from the courthouse, the fabric now soaked and clinging to his frame. Every hurried step he took caused the hem of his trousers to ride up, exposing the bulky plastic casing of the GPS tracking device strapped to his ankle. He did not care about the optics or the legal peril. Desperation had stripped away his polished corporate veneer, leaving a feral, panicked creature in its wake. He marched toward room number 12, raising his fist and pounding against the peeling paint of the wooden door. He shouted Audrey's name, the sound carrying over the heavy rainfall. He demanded she open the door, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and rage. The deadbolt clicked. Audrey stood in the doorway, framed by the dim yellow light of the cheap motel room. She wore faded sweatpants and a plain cotton shirt, devoid of her signature silk and pearls. For a fleeting second, the two architects of my betrayal stared at each other, registering the profound ruin they had mutually orchestrated. Jonathan stepped forward, pointing an accusatory finger. He ordered her to contact her legal counsel, demanding she retract whatever statement she made to the authorities during her interrogation. He promised they could coordinate a unified defense, claiming he still possessed hidden leverage to beat the indictment. He spun a frantic web of lies, insisting he could access hidden capital if she just kept her mouth shut and absorbed a fraction of the blame. Audrey let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Her survival instinct, honed through years of clawing her way out of poverty, surged to the surface. She stepped out of the doorway, confronting him under the pouring rain. She did not cower. She stood tall, shouting over the storm, mocking his delusion. She informed the disgraced logistics executive that there was no unified defense. She laid out the stark, unvarnished truth, bragging that she secured a signed proffer agreement from the Department of Justice. She confessed with terrifying pride that she handed the federal agents every forged signature, every offshore routing number, and every damning email he ever sent her. She traded his life to purchase her criminal immunity, ensuring he would rot behind concrete walls while she walked away free. Jonathan froze, the rain plastering his dark hair against his forehead. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. His supposed subordinate, the woman he thought he controlled with his charisma and empty promises, had orchestrated his ultimate execution. The realization that he had funded her escape with his own downfall left him speechless. Nathan opened his door. I opened mine. We stepped out of the warm SUV and crossed the two-lane highway, our footsteps steady against the slick asphalt. We did not rush. We moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of predators cornering their exhausted prey. Audrey spotted us first. Her triumphant sneer vanished, replaced by a sudden, bewildered pallor. Jonathan turned slowly, his eyes widening as he beheld the two figures emerging from the shadows of the storm. They thought their battle was confined to federal prosecutors and criminal indictments. They forgot the true architect of their misery was still holding the reins. I stopped 10 feet away, letting the rain wash over the shoulders of my wool trench coat. I looked at Audrey, observing the false sense of security wrapping around her like a protective shield. She actually believed her government deal provided a comprehensive shield against consequence. She thought she had outsmarted the system, severing her ties to our shared history without paying the toll. Nathan stepped forward, delivering a masterclass in terrifying legal composure. He reached inside his tailored jacket, retrieving a thick, dense envelope bound with a formal red seal. He extended his arm, offering the packet to the woman who used to be my closest confidant. Audrey hesitated, her eyes darting between my brother and me. She crossed her arms, raising her chin in a desperate display of defiance. She shouted that she possessed federal protection, insisting the government granted her full criminal amnesty. She claimed we possessed zero authority to touch her, bragging that her signature on the government affidavit rendered her untouchable. Nathan offered a cold, surgical smile. He agreed with her assessment. He confirmed the Department of Justice would never place her in a prison cell for the wire fraud conspiracy. However, he clarified a fundamental distinction in the American judicial system. Criminal immunity provides zero shelter from civil liability. He explained the contents of the heavy envelope. It contained a staggering civil lawsuit filed directly by my private holding trust, suing her for severe financial damages, breach of fiduciary duty, corporate sabotage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The paperwork represented a financial death sentence. Audrey scoffed, attempting to dismiss the threat, stating a trial would take years to prove liability and drain my resources. Nathan corrected her profound miscalculation. He reminded her of the sworn affidavit she signed just hours earlier in the interrogation room. By securing her federal deal, she provided a legally binding, verified confession, detailing her willing participation in a multi-million-dollar theft against my enterprise. That document was now public record. A civil judge would not require a lengthy trial or a drawn-out discovery process. The court would issue an immediate summary judgment based solely on her own admitted guilt. I took a step closer, my voice slicing through the rain. I explained the grim reality of her future. I promised to win a judgment so staggering she would never recover. I vowed to garnish every paycheck she ever earned, seize any asset she acquired, and shadow her financial existence until her final breath. She saved herself from a concrete cell, only to sentence herself to a lifetime of indentured poverty, serving the woman she betrayed. The thick, legal envelope slipped from Nathan's hand. It struck the wet asphalt with a heavy, definitive slap. Audrey stared down at the soaked paper. The crushing weight of her permanent ruin fractured her resilience. Her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed backward, her spine hitting a rusted soda vending machine buzzing near the motel walkway. She slid down the dented metal panel, burying her face in her hands, as deep, guttural sobs tore through her chest. Her brilliant escape plan had just transformed into an inescapable financial prison. Jonathan watched his former partner disintegrate into a puddle of despair on the dirty concrete. He looked at the thick envelope resting on the pavement, then raised his eyes to meet mine. He realized his federal arrest was merely a fraction of the devastation I had engineered. He stood alone in the freezing rain, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, his legal defense, and his remaining allies. The trap had closed tight around his throat, leaving him with one final, agonizing choice regarding the only piece of leverage he had left in the world. The Appalachian storm poured relentless sheets of freezing precipitation onto the cracked asphalt of the Starlight Inn parking lot. Audrey lay slumped against the rusted metal of a soda vending machine, her future eradicated by the binding lawsuit my brother had just dropped at her feet. She sobbed into her hands, a broken figure who had traded her loyalty for criminal immunity, only to sentence herself to a lifetime of indentured poverty. Jonathan stood paralyzed a few yards away. The sleek, gray rental sedan idling behind him offered zero sanctuary. He stared at his former partner in crime, watching her dissolve into a puddle of unrecoverable despair. His gaze shifted from her ruined form to the imposing silhouette of Nathan standing beside our vehicle. Finally, his eyes met mine. In the corporate sector, men of his specific disposition view leverage as the ultimate currency. During his ascent through the Pennsylvania logistics industry, he treated every relationship as a transactional asset to be acquired or discarded. He married a biotech heiress to secure his initial funding. He cultivated a charismatic public persona to charm venture capitalists. He even treated fatherhood as a carefully curated museum exhibit, hoisting our infant son for cameras to project the image of a grounded family man. He never valued Wyatt as a human being. The boy was merely another prop in his grand theatrical production. Stripped of his wealth, his pristine reputation, and his high-priced legal defense, Jonathan calculated his dwindling inventory. The federal ankle monitor secured to his leg blinked with a sterile green light under the neon motel sign, a constant physical reminder of his impending criminal trial. He knew my holding trust possessed the immense resources required to bury him in simultaneous litigation mirroring the exact fate currently crushing the woman crying on the pavement. The prospect of facing a two-front war snapped the final fragile threads of his pride. He took a slow step toward me. His expensive Italian leather shoes splashed through the deep, murky puddles. The downpour plastered his dark hair flat against his skull, washing away the meticulous grooming he spent hours perfecting every morning. His broad shoulders slumped forward. The towering titan of industry vanished into the night, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He closed the distance, reached the front bumper of our vehicle, and fell to his knees on the unforgiving pavement. "Sabrina!" he pleaded, his voice cracking over the roar of the wind. "Please, I have nothing left." He gripped the wet steel of the car bumper, his knuckles turning stark white from the exertion. He begged me to call off the corporate attorneys. He promised to disappear, swearing he would never set foot in Philadelphia again. "I will give you what you want," he yelled, swiping a mixture of rain and tears from his eyes. I will sign over, Wyatt. Full custody, no visitation. I will terminate my parental rights tonight. Just let me walk away from the financial damages. I looked down at the man kneeling in the dirt. A mother's love is an instinctual, fierce force, a biological imperative designed to protect her offspring from harm. A narcissist interprets that fierce devotion as a weakness meant to be exploited. He genuinely believed he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver. He assumed handing me sole ownership of our son would satisfy my desire for retribution, neutralizing the immediate threat to his own survival. I did not need to speak a single word in response. Nathan stepped forward, matching my stoic silence. My brother operated with the lethal efficiency of a seasoned surgeon. He unlatched his waterproof briefcase, withdrawing a thick stack of legal documents protected by a clear plastic sleeve. He retrieved the pages and slapped them flat against the wet hood of our SUV. Nathan explained the nature of the paperwork in a booming voice that cut clearly through the storm. These were irrevocable relinquishment forms. They contained no hidden clauses for supervised visits, no loopholes for future appeals, and no room for renegotiation. By applying his signature, Jonathan would legally become a stranger to the boy who shared his bloodline. He would sever all ties, terminating every claim, right, and privilege associated with fatherhood, forever. Jonathan did not hesitate. He did not ask for a moment to consider the profound gravity of abandoning his only child. He did not request a photograph to remember the boy he was erasing from his life. He patted the damp pockets of his ruined suit jacket, searching frantically for a writing instrument. His fingers extracted a heavy gold fountain pen. I recognized the item instantly. 2 years ago, a regional business magazine awarded him their prestigious Executive of the Year honor. Rather than thanking his dedicated team, he purchased that custom-engraved pen to celebrate his own purported genius. He used it to sign lucrative vendor contracts, approve offshore transfers, and build his fraudulent empire. Now he intended to use his favorite trophy to trade away his son. He scrambled to his feet, leaning over the hood of the vehicle. The freezing rain battered his back. He uncapped the gold pen and pressed the nib against the pristine paper. His hand shook, yet he dragged the ink across the dotted line. The elements fought against the transaction. Raindrops splattered across the page, washing over the fresh ink, causing the dark blue lines to blur and bleed into the white margins. He flipped to the second page, scribbling his name again. He initialed the required sections with frantic speed, terrified I might change my mind and unleash the civil attorneys upon him. He finished the final stroke and shoved the damp documents toward Nathan. Jonathan dropped the gold pen onto the hood, the metal clinking sharply against the steel. He exhaled a ragged breath, a cloud of white vapor escaping his lips in the cold air. "It is done," he gasped, staring at me with wide, desperate eyes. "I signed him away. You have him. Now tell your brother to back off. Swear to me you will drop the civil charges." Nathan carefully gathered the blurred yet legally binding pages and secured them inside the waterproof briefcase. I buttoned the collar of my wool trench coat, shielding myself from the biting wind. I looked at the relieved, pathetic expression anchoring his face. He actually thought he had orchestrated a successful escape. I offered him a calm, steady gaze. "I always honor my agreements," I stated, my voice echoing clearly over the storm. "I swear my private trust will not file a single civil lawsuit against you. You are free from my corporate litigation." A genuine smile broke through his shivering facade. He believed he had won the negotiation. He turned his head toward his idling rental car, calculating his driving route out of the Appalachian Mountains. "However," I continued, freezing his movements in an instant, "my brother and I only control the civil courts. The Internal Revenue Service operates under a different jurisdiction." Jonathan spun back around, the triumphant smile evaporating into a mask of pure horror. "The federal government does not negotiate civil settlements," I reminded him, watching the color drain entirely from his cheeks. And a federal magistrate explicitly ordered you to avoid contacting any co-conspirators while out on bail. Before he could fully process the fatal error of his midnight journey, a new sound pierced the heavy rainfall. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail echoing through the dark valley. Within seconds, the noise amplified, transforming into the deafening shriek of approaching sirens. A fleet of dark government vehicles crested the highway ridge, their flashing red and blue strobe lights cutting through the murky darkness. They swerved into the Starlight Inn parking lot surrounding his cheap rental sedan and blocking every possible exit route. Tactical agents poured out of the cruisers. They did not care about his former executive status or his ruined Italian shoes. They converged on him, shouting commands that drowned out the rolling thunder. They grabbed his arms, spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the wet side of our SUV. The cold click of steel handcuffs securing his wrists echoed with profound finality. As the agents dragged him backward toward the waiting transport van, Jonathan twisted his neck, his terrified eyes locking onto mine one last time. He realized the agonizing truth of his brilliant negotiation. He had surrendered his only child, sacrificing his own flesh and blood to buy his freedom, only to discover the purchase price yielded nothing but an expedited trip to a concrete cell. He traded his son for nothing. The corner office on the top floor of our Philadelphia headquarters underwent a severe physical transformation. The heavy mahogany desk Jonathan used to prop his feet upon was dismantled and hauled away the morning after his arrest. In its place stood a sleek minimalist table constructed of tempered glass and brushed steel. The sharp geometric lines of the new furniture reflected the changing era of the enterprise. I took my seat behind the transparent surface, surveying the sprawling urban skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The transition of power was official. I absorbed the shattered remnants of his logistics empire into my own, holding firm, stripping away the toxic branding he had cultivated. However, seizing the throne merely represented the initial phase of the cleansing process. A corporation relies on the integrity of its daily operations, and my ex-husband had infested the executive suites with his own reflection. He populated the upper management tiers with arrogant vice presidents who prioritized golf retreats and corporate expenditures over actual technological innovation. These were the men who conveniently looked the other way while research funds vanished into offshore accounts. They assumed the quiet female founder would lack the fortitude to disrupt the established hierarchy. I summoned a mandatory morning briefing. The remaining executives filed into the boardroom wearing their tailored suits, clutching premium coffees projecting an air of nervous bravado. They anticipated a standard transitional speech outlining steady quarterly growth. Instead, I walked around the obsidian table and placed a thin, pristine folder directly in front of each man. I did not raise my voice. I recited their specific managerial failures, detailing the inflated vendor contracts and the ignored compliance protocols. I fired every single one of them before the clock struck 9. When the senior vice president of operations threatened a wrongful termination lawsuit, I advised him to read the forensic audit summary contained within his folder. I offered him a choice between a quiet exit or a direct referral to the federal investigators currently dissecting the dummy corporation. The room remained silent as they signed their severance waivers and surrendered their security badges. The exodus created a profound power vacuum. Yet I had prepared for this exact moment for years. While Jonathan posed for magazine covers, I quietly scouted and mentored the most brilliant, overlooked minds in the Pennsylvania tech sector. Within 48 hours, my new leadership roster walked through the glass doors. I replaced the archaic boys' club with a formidable, diverse team of innovators who understood global logistics and predictive coding. The chaotic, ego-driven atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a lethal precision-engineered machine. There was one final contract to finalize. Nathan stood by the window of my office, projecting the quiet, unyielding presence of a man who orchestrates legal victories without breaking a sweat. I handed him a leather-bound document, officially naming him the Chief Legal Officer of the unified conglomerate. We shared a look of mutual respect as he signed the paperwork, cementing our partnership at the apex of the industry. While the corporate structure thrived, the fallout from the federal arrest rippled through the suburbs, decimating the enablers who facilitated the betrayal. Patricia faced the catastrophic consequences of her blind maternal devotion. Because Jonathan violated his strict release conditions by hunting down his former accomplice in the rain, the magistrate revoked his bail entirely. The $10 million bond was instantly forfeited to the state. Patricia had signed the physical deed of her historical mainline property over to the shady bail bondsman. The financial devastation was irreversible. The bank initiated ruthless foreclosure proceedings, stripping Patricia of her liquid cash, her retirement portfolios, and her pristine credit rating. She was forced to pack her belongings into the trunk of a rented sedan and vacate the premises in total disgrace. The elite country club associates she spent decades trying to impress shunned her calls, treating her like a pariah. She relocated to a cramped, noisy apartment on the fringes of the city, cut off from the wealth and prestige that defined her entire identity. I monitored the public auction of her luxury estate. I utilized a silent proxy buyer operating under an anonymous corporate umbrella to purchase the property for a fraction of its original market value. Patricia assumed a foreign investor acquired her beloved home. She remained oblivious to the reality that I now held the deed to the very residence where she actively helped hide the infidelity. I hired a vast contracting crew to gut the interior of the colonial manor. We tore down the lavish entertaining spaces, the pretentious dining hall, and the ostentatious wine cellar where she hosted her charity galas. We transformed the sprawling property into a fully funded, high-end transitional shelter for single mothers escaping financial abuse. I converted the opulent master suite into a complimentary legal aid clinic. I ensured a glossy, beautifully printed brochure of the grand opening found its way into the mailbox of Patricia's cramped new apartment, providing a stark visual reminder of her legacy. Months shifted into seasons. The legal warfare concluded, leaving the traitors buried under the weight of their own greed. Jonathan was processed into a maximum security federal penitentiary, facing a mandatory 20-year sentence without the possibility of early parole. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, my new executive assistant softly knocked on my glass door. She carried a small stack of highly vetted priority correspondence. She set the pile on my desk and excused herself. I sorted through the investment portfolios until I reached the final item at the bottom. It was a cheap, coarse brown envelope bearing the official stamp of a federal prison mail sorting facility. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the rough paper. I extracted a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting covering the page was frantic, shaky, and barely legible. It bore zero resemblance to the bold, arrogant signatures Jonathan used to slash across lucrative contracts. The sterile reality of his concrete cell had pierced his delusions. He wrote that the silence of his confinement was deafening. He confessed in plain, desperate ink that he was an empty suit, acknowledging that I was the true architect who provided everything he ever possessed. He apologized for his greed and his monstrous ego. The final sentence contained a pathetic, shattered plea. He begged me to send him just one updated photograph of Wyatt. He desired a tiny thread connecting him to the world he so carelessly discarded. I sat perfectly still, observing the cheap blue ink staining the lined paper. The sharp geometry of my glass desk highlighted the profound contrast between my reality and his ruin. I did not draft a reply. I did not reach for a photograph. I fed the fragile sheet of paper into the heavy-duty mechanical shredder beside my desk, listening to the steel blades grind his final words into unrecognizable slivers. The scene shifts from the sterile corporate tower to a breathtaking expanse of sunlit coastal lawn. I had acquired a secluded waterfront property, desiring a sanctuary far removed from the oppressive memories of the mainline estate. The manicured grass overlooked the shimmering expanse of the ocean, offering a panoramic view of the horizon. Today marked Wyatt's second birthday. The contrast to his first celebration was profound. The sprawling lawn featured no pretentious catering companies attempting to impress venture capitalists. There were no hired photographers capturing the false imagery of a perfect marriage. The gathering consisted solely of individuals who genuinely mattered. Nathan stood near a wooden picnic table, arranging a platter of fresh fruit, while chatting with the brilliant women who now managed my executive board. I stood on the edge of the stone terrace, the coastal breeze catching the fabric of my linen dress. Wyatt ran across the grass, holding a brightly colored kite string, his laughter echoing over the sound of the crashing waves. He tumbled into Nathan's arms, giggling, as my brother hoisted him onto his shoulders. People frequently suggest that living well is the finest form of retaliation. Yet in the cutthroat arenas we navigate, merely surviving a betrayal falls short of justice. True retribution involves reclaiming every ounce of your power, securing your wealth, and establishing a perimeter of impenetrable peace. It requires watching the individuals who attempted to bury you realize they were never the primary focus of your narrative. They were minor obstacles, temporary footnotes, in the grand empire you were destined to construct. Jonathan and Audrey mistook my quiet demeanor for submission. They assumed the architect would surrender the fortress without a fight. They forgot that the most formidable person in the room is rarely the one shouting for attention. The real threat is the individual silently changing the locks on the doors. I survived their deceit, weaponized their arrogance, and left them grasping at shadows. Watching Wyatt blow out 2 glowing candles surrounded by authentic love, I knew the war was over. True power does not need to boast, because unbreakable peace speaks for itself. The traditional American family is frequently heralded as the untouchable bedrock of society. We are culturally conditioned to measure success by the postal code, the historic colonial manor on the Pennsylvania Main Line, and the perfectly curated first birthday party, complete with artisanal catering and hired photographers. We are taught to protect this sacred unit at almost any cost, internalizing the belief that a 2-parent household is the ultimate gold standard for a child's well-being. Yet Sabrina Bradley's story dismantles this heavily filtered illusion with surgical, breathtaking precision. It forces us to confront a chilling reality about family responsibility and child-rearing in modern society. When the foundation of a traditional family is secretly built on deceit, the structure itself becomes the greatest hazard to the child living inside it. Sabrina's journey from a betrayed wife to an unyielding architect of justice is not merely a tale of corporate revenge. It is a profound, emotionally rich masterclass in parenting, values the necessity of absolute fairness and the long-term guidance children desperately require. In American culture, we often dilute the concept of honesty for our children, teaching them that it is simply the passive act of not telling a lie. But Sabrina's actions redefine honesty as an active, relentless, and sometimes brutal pursuit of the truth, regardless of the collateral damage to one's social standing. Her husband, Jonathan, lived his entire life as a master illusionist. He wore the mask of a devoted father and a visionary executive, while utterly hollowed out by his own unchecked narcissism. He believed that corporate power exempted him from moral accountability. A dangerous silent lesson that, left untreated, would have eventually poisoned his infant son Wyatt. Sabrina understood an undeniable truth about parenting. Children do not learn from the lectures we deliver. They absorb the behaviors we tolerate. When she discovered her husband kissing her best friend in the oak-paneled study, she did not scream. She did not engage in the messy, emotional bargaining that Jonathan expected. Her profound silence was the most honest response possible. It was the immediate, crystalline realization that a home built on a lie is no home at all. To teach Wyatt honesty, Sabrina had to eradicate the deception completely. She recognized that shielding her son from the ugly reality of his father's true character would only normalize betrayal in the boy's own future. By freezing the assets and legally excising Jonathan from their lives, she was not just protecting a financial empire. She was securing Wyatt's moral compass. Society routinely burdens mothers with the expectation of perpetual grace. The conventional narrative dictates that, for the sake of the children, a fractured traditional family should attempt mediation, reconciliation, or at the very least, a civilized shared custody arrangement. We are repeatedly told that fairness means compromise. Sabrina's story violently rejects this premise, offering a paradigm shift that is as jarring as it is necessary. In the American family court system, the default assumption is that a child inherently benefits from having both parents in their life, often regardless of a parent's moral bankruptcy. Sabrina challenged this cultural norm head-on. Fairness is not a 50-50 division of assets with a corrupt partner, nor is it granting equal parenting time to a man who would leverage his own child to avoid a civil lawsuit. True fairness requires unyielding justice. When Jonathan knelt in the freezing rain of an Appalachian motel parking lot, offering to sign away his parental rights with a custom-engraved gold pen just to save his own skin, he proved what Sabrina had known all along. He viewed his son as a bargaining chip, not a human being. Sabrina's decision to accept his relinquishment is the ultimate subversion of traditional parenting advice. She did not fight for him to be a better father. She recognized his profound inadequacy and removed the infection. This is the unconventionally brutal truth of family responsibility. You cannot co-parent with a predator. She ensured that Wyatt would grow up in an environment where fairness means facing the absolute consequences of one's actions, and where a man who steals and betrays is never rewarded with the privilege of influence. If there is a singular currency more valuable than the $14 million locked behind Sabrina's biometric firewall, it is emotional awareness. In a culture that frequently equates volume with power and aggression with strength, Sabrina demonstrated that true dominance is born of emotional regulation. She did not allow the profound trauma of the betrayal to dictate her strategy. From the moment the grandfather clock ticked in the study to the final fatal audio broadcast at the media gates, her emotions were harnessed, calculated, and deliberate. This is a critical lesson in long-term child rearing. How do we teach our children to navigate a world that will inevitably break their hearts? We model it. Sabrina's refusal to become hysterical, her refusal to be baited by her mother-in-law's desperate provocations, and her unwavering composure under the flashing strobe lights of the press served as a living blueprint for Wyatt's future. She taught her son that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the absolute mastery of oneself amidst the chaos. Jonathan, conversely, was a slave to his fragile ego, physically assaulting his accomplice and arrogantly violating his federal bail conditions. By entirely severing Wyatt from Jonathan's toxic lineage, Sabrina broke a generational cycle of narcissistic entitlement. Ultimately, this narrative demands that we evaluate what we are truly leaving behind for the next generation. The American dream is too often measured by inheritance, the stock portfolios, the luxury penthouses, the private aviation terminals. Sabrina possessed all of these, yet she understood their profound emptiness when detached from character. When she purchased her former mother-in-law's foreclosed mansion and transformed it into a transitional shelter for abused women, she was laying down a permanent, visible legacy for her son. She taught him that wealth is not a shield to hide behind, but a tool to elevate those who have been crushed by the very systems men like his father exploit. When she fed Jonathan's pathetic, tear-stained prison letter into the mechanical shredder, it was not an act of cruelty. It was the final necessary housekeeping of a cleansed life. As we navigate the complexities of our own relationships and the heavy burdens of family responsibility, Sabrina's journey forces us to look in the mirror. Are we compromising our boundaries to maintain the illusion of a happy traditional home? Are we teaching our children to tolerate disrespect in the name of keeping the family together? If you find yourself reflecting on the boundaries in your own life, or if you appreciate narratives that challenge the status quo and explore the raw, unvarnished truths of human resilience, I encourage you to follow Emily Told Stories. We explore the depths of family dynamics, second chances, and the quiet courage it takes to rewrite your own destiny. We are taught from a very young age that the highest moral ground a parent can take is forgiveness, that keeping the peace requires swallowing the poison. But Sabrina's story reveals a darker, more vital truth. Sometimes the most profound act of maternal love is absolute, unyielding destruction. The truest, most enduring peace does not come from mending what is fundamentally broken. It comes from having the terrifying courage to burn the toxic structures to the ground, salting the earth so nothing venomous can ever grow there again, and building a sanctuary in the ashes. Look at the people sitting at your own table. When the grandfather clock stops ticking and the illusions fall away, who are you really sharing your life with? And more importantly, when the storm finally breaks, will you have the strength to let them drown? Or will you let them drag you under?